Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Do you believe that some places remember us long after we've gone? I never thought I'd return to Ravenwood Academy. 15 years had passed since I last walked these halls, yet as I stood before the imposing brick building, time seemed to collapse. The abandoned school loomed against the autumn sky, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. Ivy crawled up the walls, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had left behind. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and I'm a documentary filmmaker specializing in forgotten places. At least, that's what I tell people. The truth is more complicated. I document these abandoned spaces hoping to find answers about my missing childhood friend, Thomas. He disappeared during our final year at Ravenwood, and no one ever discovered what happened to him. The school closed 3 years after Thomas vanished. Official reports cited structural problems and declining enrollment, but rumors persisted, whispers about strange occurrences, unexplained noises, and students reporting cold spots in the hallways. Some claimed they heard crying from empty classrooms. A light breeze carried the scent of wet leaves and decay as I approached the chain-link fence surrounding the property. The no trespassing sign hung crooked, its red letters faded by years of weather. I slipped through a gap in the fence, my camera bag catching momentarily on the rusted metal. The crunch of gravel beneath my boots seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I paused, listening. Something felt off. The birds had stopped singing, as if the very air around the school existed in a bubble of silence. Just your imagination, I muttered, my breath forming a small cloud in the chilled air. I made my way up the cracked concrete steps to the main entrance. The double doors were chained shut, but I'd done my research. The maintenance entrance on the east side would likely be accessible. As I walked along the perimeter, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I turned suddenly, scanning the rows of windows above me, but saw nothing beyond dusty glass. The maintenance door was indeed unlocked, its hinges groaning in protest as I pushed it open. The sound echoed through the empty building, disturbing years of silence. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a narrow hallway lined with rusted lockers. The air inside was stagnant and cold, colder than it should have been for October. I pulled my jacket tighter and proceeded deeper into the building. Water damage had left dark stains on the ceiling, and the peeling paint on the walls hung like dead skin. My footsteps echoed as I made my way toward the main hall. I'd start documenting from the principal's office, then work my way through the classrooms. But first, I wanted to see our old homeroom, room 217, where Thomas and I had spent our final year together before he vanished. As I rounded the corner into the main corridor, my flashlight beam swept across the floor, illuminating something that made me freeze. Footprints in the dust, fresh ones, too small to be from maintenance workers or other urban explorers. They looked like they belonged to a child. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I followed the prints with my eyes. They led down the hall and disappeared around the corner toward room 217. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the empty space. "Is someone here?" No response came, but as the echo of my voice faded, I heard something else, a faint sound, like chalk on a blackboard. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then silence. I stood motionless, listening intently. My rational mind suggested raccoons or maybe the building settling. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The scratching came again, more insistent this time, followed by what sounded like a child's laughter, distant and muffled, as if coming from underwater. My hand trembled slightly as I raised my camera and began recording. The viewfinder showed nothing unusual, just an empty hallway stretching before me. But the temperature continued to drop, and I could now see my breath forming clouds with each exhalation. I followed the footprints, my heartbeat quickening with each step. They led directly to room 217, stopping abruptly at the closed door. The brass number plate was tarnished but still legible. I reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment before turning it. The door swung open with surprising ease. My flashlight revealed the classroom, frozen in time. Desks arranged in neat rows, covered in a thick layer of dust. The teacher's desk at the front, still holding a cup of pencils and an ancient grade book. And the blackboard, stretching across the front wall, completely clean except for one small area in the center. Written in perfect chalk handwriting were two words, "Welcome back." I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera. Those words hadn't been there when I first swept my light across the room, I was certain of it. I raised the camera again, zooming in on the message. As I did, the temperature plummeted further, and the door behind me slammed shut with a force that sent dust clouds billowing from the floor. A whisper came from somewhere in the darkened classroom. "Daniel, you finally came back for me." It was a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years, Thomas's voice. The question seemed to float in the air around me, though I couldn't pinpoint its source. My flashlight beam darted frantically around the classroom, passing over empty desks and abandoned textbooks. Nothing moved, yet the sensation of a presence remained undeniable. "Thomas?" My voice cracked. "Is that really you?" The fluorescent bulbs overhead flickered momentarily, though the electricity had been cut years ago. In that brief flash of light, I caught a glimpse of something, or someone, sitting at the back of the classroom. A silhouette of a boy, head down as if studying. When darkness returned, the shape was gone. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. My documentary training kicked in. Document everything, question later. I raised my camera again, scanning the room methodically, narrating in a whisper. Room 217, former homeroom. Temperature has dropped significantly. Possible audio phenomena recorded. Visual anomaly observed at. My voice trailed off as I noticed something I'd missed before. On Thomas's old desk, third row, second from the window, lay a single pencil, perfectly centered. It looked new, its yellow paint unmarked by time, its tip freshly sharpened. I approached cautiously, focusing my camera on it. As I drew closer, the pencil rolled off the desk and clattered to the floor. I jumped back, colliding with another desk. The sound of metal scraping against linoleum echoed thunderously in the empty room. "This isn't real," I muttered, but my shaking hands betrayed my fear. I needed air. Abandoning my methodical approach, I lunged for the door, twisting the handle. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, rattling the entire door in its frame. "Let me out!" I shouted, panic rising in my throat. "Why would you want to leave, Danny?" The voice came from directly behind me, soft yet somehow filling the entire room. "You just got here. We have so much to catch up on." I turned slowly, pressing my back against the door. The classroom remained empty, but the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick, almost liquid, and carried the scent of chalk dust and something else. something sweet and medicinal, like the nurse's office. "What happened to you, Thomas?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. The lights flickered again, longer this time. In their glow, I saw writing appearing on the blackboard as if an invisible hand were guiding the chalk. The scratching sound returned, louder now. "I never left," the words spelled out, letter by letter. My camera recorded it all, though I doubted anything would show up in the footage. Supernatural phenomena rarely translated well to digital media, another lesson from years of documentary work. The door behind me suddenly gave way, causing me to stumble backward into the hallway. I caught myself against the opposite wall, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the corridor. When I looked back at room 217, the door was wide open, revealing an empty, ordinary classroom. No writing on the blackboard. No freshly sharpened pencil. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to process what had happened. Was it all in my head? Some manifestation of guilt over abandoning the search for Thomas years ago? A metallic clang from down the hall snapped me back to the present. It sounded like a locker door slamming shut. Then another. And another. The sound moved toward me, like an invisible hand slapping each locker door as it passed. I backed away, keeping my camera pointed toward the noise. Through the viewfinder, I saw something my naked eye couldn't perceive, a distortion in the air, moving with the sounds. A ripple, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. "Thomas, is that you?" I called out, my voice echoing through the corridor. The banging stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound, the rhythmic squeaking of the ancient water fountain at the end of the hall. Its button depressed repeatedly, though no water flowed from its rusted spout. I approached cautiously, camera still recording. As I drew closer, wet footprints appeared on the floor beneath the fountain, small, child-sized prints that glistened in my flashlight beam. They formed a trail leading around the corner, toward the stairwell. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to run from this building and never return. But I couldn't, not yet. If Thomas was here, somehow, I needed to know what happened to him. I owed him that much. I followed the wet footprints to the stairwell door. Unlike the classroom door, this one opened easily at my touch. The stairwell beyond was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. The footprints continued upward, toward the second floor. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended slowly, one hand on the railing, the other holding my camera. Each step brought me closer to a cold spot, a pocket of air so frigid it burned my lungs when I inhaled. Halfway up, I paused, listening. From above came the sound of children's voices, distant, muffled, speaking in unison. It reminded me of morning announcements, when the entire school would recite the Pledge of Allegiance together. One nation, under God, indivisible. The words became clearer as I continued climbing, though they sounded wrong somehow, distorted and echoing, as if played backward. I reached the second floor landing, my flashlight revealing another corridor lined with classrooms. The wet footprints led to the library at the far end, a place Thomas and I had spent countless hours together, hiding from bullies and sharing secrets. The double doors of the library stood ajar, a faint bluish light spilling out from within. It wasn't the harsh beam of a flashlight or the yellow glow of a lantern. It pulsed gently, almost like the light from an old television screen. As I approached, the children's voices faded, replaced by the sound of pages turning, hundreds of them, flipping rapidly in unseen books. I stepped through the doorway, and my flashlight died immediately. The only illumination came from the strange blue light, which I now saw emanated from the center of the room where the study tables used to be. In that eerie glow sat a boy with his back to me, hunched over a book. He wore the Ravenwood uniform, gray slacks, and a navy blazer with the school crest. His hair was matted to his head, as if wet. "Thomas?" I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. The figure didn't respond or turn, but the air around him rippled, and the blue light intensified, casting long shadows across the book-lined walls. I took a step forward, and the floorboard beneath my foot groaned. The boy's head snapped up at the sound, though he still didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here after hours, Danny," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "You know what happens to students who break the rules." Before I could respond, every book on the surrounding shelves flew open simultaneously, their pages flipping violently as if caught in a windstorm. The blue light flickered, and in that stuttering illumination, the boy slowly began to turn toward me. I raised my camera instinctively, though it remained dead in my hands. As the figure completed its turn, I saw not Thomas's face, but a void, a swirling darkness where features should have been. Water dripped from his uniform, pooling on the floor beneath him. "They never found me," the thing that wasn't Thomas said, its voice now a gurgling whisper. "But you will." The blue light went out, plunging the library into total darkness. In complete darkness, terror becomes a physical thing, a weight pressing against your chest, restricting your breath, clouding your thoughts. I stood frozen in the library, unable to see, my useless camera clutched in trembling hands. "Thomas," I whispered, "I want to help you." The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere nearby. Drip, drip, drip. Rhythmic, like a countdown. My flashlight flickered back to life without warning, its beam weaker than before but enough to confirm I was alone in the library. The study tables stood empty, covered in dust. No sign of the boy, the blue light, or the mysteriously open books. But there, on the floor where he had been sitting, was a puddle of water. I knelt beside it, watching as it spread slowly outward, defying physics. The water moved with purpose, stretching into a thin line that pointed toward the library exit like a liquid finger. A memory surfaced, Thomas telling me about his special place, somewhere he went when he needed to think. "The pool is different when it's empty," he had said. "It's like being in another world." The school swimming pool. Located in the basement, it had been drained the year before we graduated due to budget cuts. Thomas had somehow found a way in, despite the locked doors. I followed the water trail out of the library and back to the stairwell. This time, it led downward, past the first floor, into the basement. The temperature dropped with each step, until my breath clouded before me in dense white puffs. The basement corridor was narrower than the upper floors, its ceiling low and lined with exposed pipes. My flashlight revealed peeling paint and rusted metal, but the water trail remained clear, leading me past the boiler room and old storage areas to a set of double doors marked "Pool Authorized Personnel Only." The lock had been broken long ago, the doors secured with a simple chain. But as I approached, the chain fell away, clattering to the concrete floor. The doors creaked open on their own, revealing darkness beyond. I hesitated at the threshold, my instincts screaming danger. But I had come too far to turn back now. "I'm here, Thomas," I called into the darkness. "I'm here to find you." I stepped through the doorway into the pool area. My flashlight beam swept across tiled walls and empty bleachers before settling on the pool itself. It was no longer empty as I had expected. Water filled it to the brim, its surface perfectly still, reflecting my light like a mirror. This was impossible. The pool had been drained 15 years ago, its pipes shut down. Even if the drainage had somehow failed, years of evaporation would have reduced any remaining water to nothing. Yet there it was, a full Olympic-sized pool, its water clear and still in the beam of my flashlight. The air here felt different, heavy with chlorine and something else, something organic and wrong. I approached the edge cautiously, pointing my camera at the water despite knowing it probably wasn't working. The surface of the pool began to ripple, though there was no breeze. Small waves formed, moving against natural currents to create patterns, letters, I realized with growing horror. The water was spelling out words. "Come in." I stepped back from the edge, shaking my head. "I can't swim," I said aloud, another memory surfacing. It was true, despite growing up with a pool at my school, I never learned. My fear of water had always been too great. Thomas knew this. He had tried to teach me once, but after I panicked and nearly dragged us both under, he never asked again. The ripples changed, forming new words. "You don't need to swim." From the center of the pool, something broke the surface, a hand, pale and small, reaching upward before sinking back down. "Thomas!" I shouted, dropping to my knees at the pool's edge. I leaned forward, searching the depths with my flashlight. The beam penetrated only a few feet before the water seemed to swallow the light. The hand appeared again, farther from the center now, closer to where I knelt. It was followed by another hand, then the top of a head, dark hair plastered to a pale scalp. I reached out instinctively, my fingertips nearly touching the outstretched hand. At the last moment, I pulled back, remembering countless horror stories where the victim is dragged into water, into quicksand, into darkness. "Thomas, tell me what happened," I pleaded. "Tell me how to help you." The figure in the water sank lower, only the eyes remaining above the surface now. They were Thomas's eyes. I recognized them instantly, but something was wrong. They were too wide, too empty, like glass marbles pushed into dough. "It wasn't an accident," came a voice, not from the pool but from behind me. I whirled around to see a janitor's mop bucket that hadn't been there before. Water sloshed inside it as if something had disturbed it from within. "What wasn't an accident?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The bucket tipped over by itself, water spilling across the tiled floor, flowing with unnatural purpose to form words. They held me under. Ice formed in my veins as understanding dawned. The rumors after Thomas disappeared, whispers of bullying gone too far, of a prank that ended in tragedy. "Who?" I whispered. "Who did this to you?" The water from the bucket flowed back into the pool, leaving the tiles dry. The surface of the pool began to churn, no longer calm but agitated, as if a storm brewed beneath its surface. A face emerged, not Thomas's, but another boy I recognized. Philip Weldon, one of the seniors who had tormented us relentlessly. Then another face, Marcus Trent. And another, Christopher Dawson. The bullies who had made our lives hell. All rising from the water, their features distorted, eyes blank. They surrounded Thomas, forming a circle in the water. Though their mouths didn't move, I could hear their voices echoing off the pool walls. "Just a joke. Didn't mean to. He should have fought harder. No one was supposed to know." The scene played out before me like a macabre theater, Thomas in the center, the others pushing him down, holding him under. His struggles weakening. Air bubbles escaping from his mouth. Then stillness. I watched, paralyzed with horror, as they weighted his body with pool equipment and swore each other to secrecy. The vision faded, leaving only the still water of the pool. Thomas's hand broke the surface once more, reaching toward me. "I need you to tell them," his voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "I need you to make them remember." My heart pounded against my ribs. I understood now why I'd been drawn back here, why Thomas's spirit remained. The truth had never come to light. His body had never been found. His killers had gone unpunished. "I'll tell them," I promised. "I'll make sure everyone knows what happened." The hand sank beneath the surface again. For a moment, all was quiet. Then the water began to drain rapidly, swirling into a vortex at the center of the pool. As it receded, something became visible at the bottom, a dark shape huddled in a corner near the deep end. My flashlight revealed what I had both expected and dreaded: skeletal remains in tattered Ravenwood uniform, pinned beneath rusted pool equipment. I stumbled to my feet, backing away from the edge. My camera suddenly roared to life in my hands, its screen showing not the empty pool before me, but Thomas, whole, alive, smiling, standing at the pool's edge. "Thank you," he said, his image flickering on the screen. "But they won't let you leave now. They've been waiting for someone to find out. They've been waiting for you." The doors behind me slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The lights, which shouldn't have worked in an abandoned building, flared to life, illuminating the pool area in harsh fluorescent brightness. And there, blocking my path to the exit, stood 3 figures in Ravenwood uniforms, their faces older versions of the boys I'd seen in the vision. Men now, in their 30s like me, but unmistakably Philip, Marcus, and Christopher. "You shouldn't have come back, Mitchell," Philip said, his voice just as menacing as I remembered. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried," added Marcus. I raised my camera like a shield, backing away. "It's all recorded," I lied, hoping they couldn't tell the camera had only started working moments ago. "Everything Thomas showed me. The truth about what you did." Christopher laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally. "No one will ever see that footage." As they advanced toward me, the water remaining in the pool began to rise, not filling from below, but crawling up the sides, defying gravity. It flowed across the floor toward the 3 men, coalescing around their feet. They didn't notice at first, too focused on me. But then Philip looked down, his expression changing from menace to confusion, then to fear as the water climbed up his legs, solidifying like ice. The others realized too late what was happening. The water engulfed them rapidly, their screams cut short as it covered their faces, hardening into a clear, solid mass. They remained visible inside, eyes wide with terror, frozen in poses of struggle. Behind them, the exit doors swung open, revealing the corridor beyond. Thomas's voice came one last time, soft in my ear. "Go. Tell our story. I can rest now." I ran. My feet pounded against concrete as I fled the pool area, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The basement corridor stretched before me, illuminated by my wildly swinging flashlight beam. I didn't look back, couldn't bear to see if those frozen figures were somehow following, or worse, if they had been nothing but hallucinations. I reached the stairwell and took the steps 2 at a time, my camera clutched tightly against my chest. If it had captured even a fraction of what I'd witnessed, it would be enough. Enough to reopen the investigation, enough to bring justice for Thomas after all these years. The main floor seemed different as I emerged from the stairwell, brighter somehow, though no lights were on. Moonlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the checkered linoleum. The silence felt absolute after the chaos of the pool room. I needed to find a way out, but something pulled me in another direction. A compulsion I couldn't explain led me down the corridor toward the administrative offices. The main entrance remained chained shut, but I knew the layout of Ravenwood well enough to navigate to a side exit. Yet my feet carried me past that turn toward the principal's office and, beside it, the records room. Just a little more evidence, I whispered to myself, justifying this detour. Something tangible to back up the footage. The records room door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of silvery light spilling from within. I approached cautiously, camera raised, ready to document whatever I might find. The room beyond was a time capsule, filing cabinets lining the walls, a microfiche reader in one corner, stacks of yearbooks on a center table. Dust covered everything in a thin gray blanket, undisturbed except for a single clear path leading to the cabinet labeled Student Records, MP. My flashlight revealed finger marks in the dust on the drawer handle, as if someone had recently opened it. The drawer slid out smoothly, too smoothly for something in use for 15 years. Inside, the files were arranged alphabetically, and I quickly found what I was looking for: Mitchell, Daniel. Beside it, as if waiting for me, was Morgan, Thomas. I pulled both folders, my hands trembling slightly. My own file contained nothing surprising: academic records, attendance sheets, a few disciplinary notes from that final year when grief over Thomas's disappearance had led me to act out. Thomas's file was thicker, containing not just school records but also police reports and newspaper clippings about his disappearance. The official conclusion: runaway, possibly suicidal due to documented bullying incidents. But tucked at the back of the folder, in an envelope marked confidential, I found something unexpected: a handwritten statement from the school nurse, dated 1 week after Thomas vanished. Student Philip Weldon came to my office requesting bandages for lacerations on his arms, it read. When questioned, he claimed they were from climbing through a broken window. The cuts appeared defensive in nature. Students Marcus Trent and Christopher Dawson accompanied him, all three exhibiting unusual behavior, nervous, speaking over each other. I overheard Marcus tell Philip to stick to the story. I reported this to Principal Hayward, who said he would handle it. The statement was signed Margaret Winters, RN, and stamped filed, and no further action. My heart raced as I read it. The nurse had suspected something, had reported it, but the principal had buried it. Principal Hayward, who had retired suddenly that same year. Principal Hayward, whose son had been friends with Philip Weldon. I tucked the statement into my pocket and continued searching. Another file caught my eye, labeled simply Incident Report, Pool Facility. Inside was a maintenance request dated 2 days after Thomas disappeared, asking for repairs to the pool drain and filtration system that had become unexpectedly clogged. The pieces were falling into place, confirming the vision Thomas had shown me. I gathered these documents, prepared to finally leave, when the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath clouded before me, and the door I'd left ajar slowly swung closed with a definitive click. "You've found what you came for," said a voice behind me, adult, male, unfamiliar. I turned to find a man in his 60s standing by the microfiche machine. He wore an outdated suit, his tie bearing the Ravenwood crest. His eyes were tired, haunted. I recognized him immediately from school photos, Principal Robert Hayward. "You covered it up," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "You knew what they did to Thomas." Hayward's expression remained impassive, but his eyes flickered with something: regret, perhaps. "My son was involved," he said quietly. "Not in the incident itself, but after." He helped them hide what they'd done. I found out too late. That doesn't justify. No, he interrupted, raising a hand. Nothing justifies it. I made a choice, a terrible, unforgivable choice, to protect my son. To protect the school's reputation. He moved toward me, and I backed away instinctively. But there was no menace in his approach. He seemed weary, defeated. I've been trapped here since I died, he continued. 7 years now, watching these halls, hearing him cry. Unable to pass on because of what I did. Or rather, what I failed to do. I couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too disturbing. Dead? He smiled sadly. Yes. Heart attack, 2018. Quite alone in my home. Poetic justice, perhaps. But death didn't free me from this place. I raised my camera, capturing his image, though I doubted anything would appear in the footage. Why are you showing yourself to me? Why now? Because you can end this. For Thomas. For me. For all of us bound to this place. He gestured around the room. There's one more piece you haven't found. He pointed to a yearbook on the center table from our final year, the one that had gone to print after Thomas disappeared. I opened it cautiously, turning to the class photos. Thomas's picture was there, marked with a small star. Beneath it, the caption read, Thomas Morgan, missing since October 12th. Look at the swimming team photo, Hayward instructed. I turned to the athletics section. The swim team posed by the pool, Philip, Marcus, and Christopher standing together at one end. Their expressions were somber, appropriate for a team that had lost a schoolmate, but their eyes held something else. Something cold. Turn the page, Hayward said. On the next page was a candid shot of the pool area, students diving and swimming during what appeared to be a practice session. But in the background, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a splash near the deep end. A hand reaching up from the water. The photographer had captured the exact moment of Thomas's final struggle. The photographer didn't realize what he captured until the yearbooks were already printed, Hayward explained. He came to me, confused, asking if that could possibly be Thomas in the background on the day he allegedly ran away. I convinced him he was mistaken. My fingers traced the image, anger and grief welling up inside me. You let them get away with murder. Yes. The simple admission hung in the cold air between us. Your son took his own life 3 years later, Hayward said, his voice breaking. Left a note confessing what he knew, what I had helped conceal. The guilt consumed him. I closed the yearbook, tucking it under my arm with the other evidence. I'm taking all of this. The truth is finally going to come out. Hayward nodded. That's why he brought you here. Not just for justice, but for release. We're all bound here, Thomas by the truth untold, me by my complicity, those three by their guilt. Even now, they're joining us. A chill ran through me as I understood his meaning. You mean Philip, Marcus, and Christopher? They're here? In the building? They received a message, Hayward said, his form beginning to fade. An invitation to meet at their old school tonight. To discuss a documentary about Ravenwood's history, said by a filmmaker named Daniel Mitchell. They couldn't resist the opportunity to ensure their version of the story would be told. Horror dawned as I realized the implication. I didn't send any invitation. No, Hayward agreed, now barely visible. Thomas did. The sound of the main entrance doors slamming open echoed through the building, followed by voices, adult male voices calling my name. Daniel? Are you in here? Got your message about the documentary. This place is even creepier than I remembered. Let's find Mitchell and get this over with. Hayward's form had completely disappeared, but his voice remained, whispering in my ear, "The pool is waiting for them." It's been waiting for 15 years. I stood frozen, clutching the evidence of their crime as footsteps approached down the corridor. The temperature continued to drop, frost forming on the filing cabinets around me. My camera screen flickered, showing not the records room, but the pool, its surface now churning violently, water climbing the walls like living tendrils. The footsteps grew closer. I had a choice to make: confront these men with the evidence I'd found, or flee with it, let Thomas exact his revenge, and tell the story afterward. Justice or vengeance? The law or a ghost's retribution? I made my decision as the handle of the records room door began to turn. The door swung open, revealing 3 middle-aged men, older versions of the boys who had tormented us, who had killed Thomas and hidden his body. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to shock as they recognized me, clutching evidence of their crime. Philip recovered first, his face hardening into the same intimidating mask I remembered from our school days. Mitchell. Didn't realize you'd be here already. Gathering background for the documentary, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded, including some interesting historical records. Marcus's eyes darted to the folders in my arms, then to my camera. What kind of historical records? The truth about Thomas Morgan, I replied simply. The temperature in the room plummeted further. Frost patterns spread across the windows like skeletal fingers. The men noticed it too, exchanging uneasy glances. That's ancient history, Christopher said, forcing a laugh that died quickly in the frigid air. Nobody cares about some runaway kid from 15 years ago. He didn't run away. I placed my camera on the table, angling its screen toward them. And I think you know that better than anyone. On the screen, impossible footage played, not what I had filmed, but what Thomas wanted them to see. The pool, 15 years ago. The 3 of them surrounding Thomas, taunting him. The struggle. The moment they held him under too long. Their panic when they realized what they'd done. Their faces drained of color as they watched, transfixed by the evidence of their crime played back to them through impossible means. The footage showed everything: their younger selves weighing down Thomas's body, their frantic cover-up, the lies they told when questioned. "This isn't real," Philip whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You've doctored this footage somehow." "You know I haven't," I replied. "Just as you know what's waiting for you in the pool." At the mention of the pool, the building itself seemed to react. A low groaning sound emanated from the walls, pipes rattling behind the plaster. Water began to seep from the ceiling, first in small droplets, then in steady streams. Marcus made a sudden move toward me, but Christopher grabbed his arm. "Don't," he warned, his eyes wide with fear. "Something's wrong here." "You're damn right something's wrong," I said, my courage growing with each passing second. "A boy was murdered in this school, his killers went free, and his body has been hidden for 15 years. But that ends tonight." The water flowing from the ceiling formed puddles on the floor, puddles that defy gravity by flowing uphill, surrounding the 3 men like a living thing. "What the hell is this?" Philip demanded, trying to step away from the encroaching water, only to find it following his movements. "This is Thomas," I said simply. "He's been waiting for you." The overhead lights flickered on, impossible in an abandoned building. The water rose higher, now ankle-deep and rising rapidly. A current formed, pulling our legs, drawing us toward the door. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, panic evident in his voice. "Yes," I agreed, gathering the evidence I'd collected. "We do, but not to the exit." The current was too strong to resist, dragging us down the corridor toward the stairwell. The three men struggled against it, but the water seemed to have a will of its own, carrying us inexorably toward the basement. "Please," Christopher begged, his former arrogance replaced by naked terror. "Whatever you think we did." "I don't think." "I know," I interrupted. "And so does Thomas." As if summoned by his name, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a boy in a soaked Ravenwood uniform, water streaming from his clothes, his hair plastered to his head. Thomas, as he looked the day he died, but with eyes that held 15 years of waiting. Philip screamed at the sight, a sound so primal it barely seemed human. He tried to run in the opposite direction, but slipped in the water and fell. When he rose, Thomas stood directly before him. "You promised no one would ever know," Thomas said, his voice gurgling as if speaking through water. "You promised it would stay a secret forever." Philip backed away, colliding with Marcus and Christopher, who stood frozen in horror. "It was an accident," Philip pleaded. "We never meant to." "Liar," Thomas hissed, water spraying from his mouth with the word. "You held me down. You laughed while I struggled. You watched the bubble stop." The water rose higher, now at our waists, the current strengthening. The building's groaning intensified, the walls seeming to contract around us like a living thing. "What do you want?" Marcus cried, tears streaming down his face. "What do you want from us?" Thomas smiled, a terrible sight on his waterlogged face. "I want you to remember." The current surged, sweeping us off our feet. I managed to keep the evidence above water, but the three men weren't so lucky. They were dragged under, resurfacing seconds later, gasping and sputtering. We were carried downward, through the doors to the basement, along the corridor, to the pool area. The doors burst open before us, revealing the pool, no longer empty but filled to the brim, its surface churning like the sea in a storm. The current deposited us at the pool's edge, the water receding from around our bodies but still blocking any escape route. Thomas stood at the opposite side, watching silently. "It doesn't have to end this way," I said to the three terrified men. "Confess. Tell the authorities what you did. Face justice through the law." For a moment, it seemed they might agree. Christopher nodded shakily, his face ashen. Okay, we'll confess. Just get us out of here." But Philip, even now, couldn't surrender. "They'll never believe it," he snarled. "No evidence after 15 years. It'll be our word against." "Against this," I interrupted, holding up the files and the yearbook. "Plus the nurse's statement, the maintenance report about the clogged filters, and whatever my camera recorded tonight." "Your camera?" Marcus looked at the device still clutched in my hand. "You think anyone will believe?" "Take a look," I said, offering it to him. With trembling hands, he took the camera and looked at the screen. His face went slack with shock. "It's all there," he whispered. "Everything. How is this possible?" "Thomas has been waiting a long time to tell his story," I replied. The water in the pool began to rise, spilling over the edges, creeping toward us once more. From its depths emerged another figure, Principal Hayward, his spectral form gliding to stand beside Thomas. "I failed in my duty," Hayward said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I put the school's reputation, my son's safety, above justice. I cannot undo that choice, but I can bear witness now." Christopher fell to his knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," he cried. "God, I'm so sorry. We were just kids. We didn't mean it to go so far." Marcus joined him, nodding frantically. "It was supposed to be a prank, just to scare him. But then he started fighting back, scratching, and Philip got angry." All eyes turned to Philip, who stood rigid, defiant even now. "Nothing to say?" I asked him. "You think I'm afraid of a ghost?" He spat, though his shaking voice betrayed him. "Or juvie records from when we were minors? My father's attorneys will have this buried before breakfast." Thomas moved then, gliding across the surface of the pool without creating a ripple. He stopped directly before Philip, water dripping from his uniform to pool at Philip's feet. "You're not afraid of ghosts," Thomas acknowledged, his voice surprisingly gentle. "But you are afraid of the truth. You always have been." The water from the pool rose in a sudden surge, wrapping around Philip's legs like tentacles, dragging him toward the edge. He screamed, clawing at the wet tiles, finding no purchase. "Stop!" I shouted, lurching forward. "Thomas, don't do this." Thomas turned to me, his expression sorrowful. "I didn't bring you here for revenge, Danny. I brought you here for truth." The water released Philip, who collapsed in a trembling heap. In the center of the pool, the water began to recede, draining away to reveal what lay at the bottom: skeletal remains and tattered clothing, weighed down by pool equipment, exactly as I had seen in my vision. "There," Thomas said, pointing. "That's where they left me. That's where I've been all these years." Christopher and Marcus continued to sob, but Philip stared at the remains with an expression I couldn't read, part horror, part relief, as if a burden carried for 15 years was finally being set down. "It's over," I said quietly. "The truth is out. You can rest now, Thomas." Thomas smiled, a real smile this time, not the terrible grimace from before. "Not quite yet." He turned to the three men. "You need to say it. All of you. Say what you did." One by one, they confessed. Christopher first, then Marcus, describing in halting detail what had happened that day, the bullying that went too far, the moment of panic when they realized Thomas wasn't breathing, the hasty decision to hide his body, the pact of silence that had bound them for 15 years. Only Philip remained silent until Thomas stood before him once more. "Say it," Thomas demanded. Philip looked up, tears streaming down his face. "I killed you," he whispered. "I held you under until you stopped moving. I convinced the others to help hide your body. I made them swear never to tell." He lowered his head. "And I've seen your face every night in my dreams for 15 years. A sigh seemed to pass through the entire building, as if the structure itself had been holding its breath. The water that had surrounded us receded, flowing back into the pool, covering the skeletal remains once more. Thomas looked at me, his form already beginning to fade. "Take care of this, Danny. Make sure they keep their word." "I will," I promised. "Your parents deserve to know what happened. They deserve to give you a proper burial." Thomas nodded, his image growing more transparent by the second. "Thank you for coming back." His gaze shifted to Principal Hayward, who also began to fade. "Both of us can rest now." The pool water settled, becoming still and clear. The building stopped its groaning, the oppressive atmosphere lifting like a fog. Thomas and Hayward were gone, leaving only ripples on the water's surface. I turned to the three men, my former tormentors, now broken and sobbing on the floor of the pool facility. "Here's what happens next," I said, my voice steady and determined. "We're leaving this building together. We're going to the police station. You're going to confess, again, and tell them where to find Thomas's remains. And I'll be turning over all of this evidence." I held up the files and camera. They nodded mutely, too drained to resist. "If you try to change your story later, if high-priced lawyers suddenly develop amnesia on your behalf." I gestured to the pool, now just an ordinary pool, yet somehow still ominous. "Remember what happened here tonight. Remember that Thomas waited 15 years for justice. He can wait longer if necessary." We left Ravenwood Academy together as dawn broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The building behind us stood silent, its windows like eyes watching our departure. But its heaviness, its wrongness, had disappeared. As we reached my car, I looked back one last time. In an upper window, just for a moment, I thought I saw a boy's figure watching, not dripping with water or pale with death, but whole and at peace, raising his hand in a final farewell before fading into the morning light. The ghost of the old school could finally rest. And so could I. Have you ever felt that the dead might be listening to your footsteps? The full moon hung bloated in the night sky, casting an unnatural silver glow across the ancient cemetery gates. I stood there, my breath forming small clouds in the autumn air, wondering why I had accepted this ridiculous dare. The rusted wrought iron gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound slicing through the midnight silence like a scream. "Just walk through the cemetery and back," they had said. 1 hour is all it takes to win the bet. My friend's laughter still echoed in my ears as I took my first tentative steps onto the gravel path. I had always prided myself on my rationality. Ghost stories were for children, and superstitions belonged to a bygone era. Yet standing there, surrounded by centuries-old tombstones, something primitive stirred within me, an instinct older than reason. The village of Raven Hollow had always been full of tales about this place. The elders spoke in hushed tones about the restless souls that walked these grounds during the full moon, about the cries that echoed through the valley on windless nights. I had dismissed these stories my entire life, but now, alone among the dead, those tales clawed at the edges of my mind. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, not entirely from the cold. The cemetery stretched before me, a maze of weathered headstones and ancient family crypts. Some markers dated back 300 years, their inscriptions worn away by time and elements. Oak trees, gnarled with age, stood like silent sentinels throughout the grounds. 20 steps in, I noticed something odd. The usual nighttime sounds, crickets, distant owls, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, had disappeared. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton wool, unnatural and suffocating. I checked my watch. 11:23. Just under an hour to go. Simple enough. As I ventured deeper, following the main path that cut through the center of the cemetery, I became aware of a subtle change in the air. It wasn't a smell exactly, more like a thickness that made each breath feel heavier than the last. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned quickly, certain I would catch someone, or something, watching me. Nothing but moonlight and shadows. Yet the feeling persisted. Eyes, invisible but present, tracking my every movement. I quickened my pace, trying to focus on the path ahead rather than the growing sensation of being observed from all sides. A whisper drifted past my ear, so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the wind through the yew trees. But there was no wind tonight. The air hung perfectly still. "Welcome." I froze mid-step, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The word had been clear, distinct, a greeting that carried both invitation and warning. "Hello?" My voice sounded small and fragile in the vast silence. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but as I stood rigid with fear, I noticed something I had missed before. The shadows cast by the gravestones weren't falling in the direction they should. Some seemed to stretch toward me, regardless of where the moonlight fell. I told myself it was a trick of perspective, an optical illusion caused by fear and suggestion. But even as rational explanations formed in my mind, I watched as one shadow, cast by a large angel statue, slowly extended across the path in front of me, though the statue itself remained motionless. The whisper came again, this time from behind me, "Stay with us." I whirled around, nearly losing my balance. "Who's there?" "This isn't funny." My words echoed back at me, bouncing off marble and granite. And beneath that echo, something else, a soft, continuous murmur, like dozens of voices speaking just below the threshold of hearing. The whispers were multiplying, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out distinct words anymore, just a rising tide of unintelligible sound that seemed to be building towards something terrible. I checked my watch again. 11:31. Not even 10 minutes had passed. The thought of spending another 50 minutes in this place suddenly seemed impossible. "Forget the bet," I muttered, turning back toward the gate. That's when I noticed the mist, thin wisps of white vapor rising from the ground around certain graves. It clung to the earth, no more than ankle high, but spreading like spilled milk across the cemetery floor. And it was moving against the stillness of the air, flowing with purpose, converging on the path ahead. The whispers grew louder. I increased my pace, trying to retrace my steps to the entrance. The gate couldn't be more than 100 yards away, yet somehow the path seemed longer than before. The landmarks I had noted on my way in, the distinctive obelisk, the weeping angel statue, the ancient oak with its twisted branches, appeared to have changed positions. Had I taken a wrong turn? Impossible. The cemetery had only one main path that cut straight through. "This is ridiculous," I spoke aloud, hoping the sound of my own voice would ground me in reality. But the words seemed to disappear into the mist, swallowed whole without an echo. The mist was thickening now, rising from knee-height to waist-high, obscuring the lower portions of the gravestones. I could still see their tops looming above the white vapor, but they appeared to be floating, disconnected from the earth. The effect was disorienting, like walking through a sea of clouds with islands of stone jutting through the surface. A soft, rhythmic sound caught my attention, a gentle padding, like bare feet on damp earth. It moved in circles around me, never visible, always just beyond the range of my sight. I spun in place, trying to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to shift position whenever I turned toward it. My heart raced. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for the comfort of its light. The screen illuminated, briefly cutting through the darkness, but the battery indicator flashed red, 3% remaining. Impossible. I had charged it fully before leaving. As if sensing my distress, the whispers intensified, becoming more distinct. "Join us." So alone. Time stretches here. Forever is just beginning. I could distinguish individual voices now, some high and childlike, others deep and resonant with age, all of them carrying a plaintive, yearning quality that tugged at something deep inside me. "Leave me alone," I said, trying to sound commanding but hearing the quaver in my voice. "I don't belong here." A sound like soft, mournful laughter rippled through the mist. "Everyone belongs here, eventually." The temperature dropped suddenly, my breath clouding more heavily before me. The cold penetrated my jacket, sinking deep into my bones with an intensity that felt personal, purposeful, as if the very air was trying to extract my body's warmth. I checked my watch again. 11:47. That couldn't be right. I'd only been here about 15 minutes, yet the time showed I'd been wandering for almost half an hour. I tapped the watch face, certain it must be malfunctioning, but the second hand continued its steady sweep. Time was behaving strangely here, stretching and contracting like something alive and playful. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I abandoned all pretense of calmly walking and broke into a run, no longer concerned with following the path. I would cut straight across the cemetery if necessary, anything to reach the gate more quickly. But as my feet pounded against the earth, something alarming happened. The ground beneath me began to feel inconsistent. Some steps were firm, the expected resistance of packed soil. Others sank slightly, as if I were running across a waterbed. And occasionally, most disturbingly, a footfall would meet almost no resistance at all, as if I were about to plunge through the surface into some void below. I slowed, suddenly afraid of breaking through the earth into God knows what. The cemetery no longer felt like a place built atop solid ground, but rather a thin membrane stretched across something vast and hungry. The padding sound grew louder, more urgent, a counterpoint to my own cautious steps. It was joined by another sound, a slow, methodical scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood from within a buried coffin. The mist continued to rise, now reaching my chest, swirling around me in patterns that couldn't be explained by any natural air current. Within its undulating folds, I began to see shapes, fleeting, half-formed figures that assembled themselves briefly before dissolving back into vapor. A child's face formed before me, eyes hollow and mouth stretched in a silent cry. An old woman's gnarled hand reached toward me from the fog, fingers elongated beyond human proportions. A man's torso, missing its lower half, drifted past like a swimmer in murky water. I stumbled backward, colliding with a gravestone. As my hand touched the cold marble to steady myself, a jolt like static electricity shot up my arm. But it carried more than just a physical sensation. It brought with it a flash of memory that wasn't my own, a woman in 19th century clothing, racked with consumption, struggling for her final breath as family members whipped around her bed. I yanked my hand away with a cry, but the damage was done. The boundary between the dead and the living, between past and present, was thinning with each passing moment. The whispers had organized themselves into a chant now, dozens of voices speaking in unison. The veil is thinnest when the moon is full. The dead remember what the living forget. Walk with us. Talk with us. Be with us. I tried to block out the voices, focusing instead on finding my way out. But the geography of the cemetery continued to shift around me. Gravestones appeared where none had been before. Paths branched and twisted back on themselves. The gate was nowhere to be seen. And most disturbing of all, the sky above had changed. The moon, which had been full and silver just moments before, now hung bloated and red in the black expanse, casting a bloody glow across the mist-covered grounds. Stars winked in unfamiliar patterns, constellations I had never seen before. A terrible thought struck me. What if I hadn't just lost my way in the cemetery? What if I had crossed some threshold into a place that merely resembled the world I knew? The mist parted briefly, and I spotted the large mausoleum that marked the center of the cemetery. At least that landmark remained. I headed toward it, hoping to regain my bearings. As I approached the stone structure, I noticed something odd about its entrance. The heavy iron door, which had always been firmly shut on my previous daytime visits, now stood slightly ajar. A faint, pulsing light emanated from within, not the steady beam of a flashlight or lantern, but an organic glow that strengthened and dimmed like a heartbeat. Logic told me to turn away, to keep searching for the exit. But a strange compulsion pulled me forward, an almost magnetic attraction I couldn't resist. 3 steps from the mausoleum door, I heard something new, a single voice, clearer than all the others, speaking directly into my ear though no one stood beside me. "We've been waiting for you to return. It's been so long." The voice was familiar in a way I couldn't possibly explain, as if I had known it my entire life, though I was certain I had never heard it before. With trembling hands, I reached for the mausoleum door. My fingers wrapped around the cold iron handle of the mausoleum door. A vibration traveled up my arm, subtle at first, then intensifying until my entire body hummed with it. Not unpleasant, but utterly foreign, as if my cells were resonating at a frequency they weren't designed to endure. "This is insane," I whispered to myself. "Turn around. Go back." But which way was back? The cemetery had become a labyrinth, familiar paths twisted into impossible configurations. The mausoleum, with its pulsing inner light, now seemed like the only constant in this shifting landscape. I pulled the door wider. The hinges released a sound that wasn't quite a creak, more like a sigh of relief, as if the structure had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. The pulsing light within flared brighter as the door opened fully, momentarily blinding me. I raised my arm to shield my eyes, blinking rapidly to adjust to the sudden brilliance. When my vision cleared, I found myself staring into an interior that defied all logic and architectural possibility. The mausoleum, which from the outside appeared no larger than a small room, opened into a vast chamber that stretched far beyond the structure's physical dimensions. Row upon row of stone sarcophagi lined a floor that seemed to extend for hundreds of yards. The ceiling soared upward, supported by twisted columns that resembled human spines more than classical architecture. And everywhere there was light, not from any discernible source, but emanating from the very air itself, a pearlescent glow that shifted and swirled like the mist outside. Most disturbing of all were the walls. Each stone block was inscribed with a name and 2 gates. Thousands upon thousands of them, stretching as far as I could see. Some names I recognized from the headstones outside, but others were unfamiliar, foreign-sounding, ancient. "We keep record of all who pass," the familiar voice explained, now seeming to come from everywhere within the chamber. "Every soul that has walked these grounds remains connected to them." I stepped further inside, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear. The door swung shut behind me with a soft thud, but I barely registered it. My attention had fixed on something at the center of the chamber, a raised dais upon which sat a single open book, its pages glowing with the same pulsating light. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice stronger than I expected, echoing through the impossible space. "The threshold," came the answer. "Neither fully of your world nor entirely separate from it. A place where memories collect and time loses meaning." As I approached the dais, the whispers that had followed me through the cemetery grew louder again, but now they had a different quality, less threatening, more welcoming. The voices seemed to be guiding me forward, encouraging each step. The book drew me like a magnet. Its pages appeared to be made of some material that wasn't quite paper, thinner, almost translucent, with a subtle iridescence. Text flowed across them in scripts both familiar and alien, constantly shifting and reforming. The Book of Names, the voice said. Every soul that passes through leaves their mark. Some briefly, others more permanently. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the flowing text. As I did, the characters seemed to stabilize, coalescing into readable words. Names appeared, accompanied by brief descriptions, not just dates of birth and death, but fragments of lives, hopes, dreams, regrets, final thoughts. My eyes widened as I spotted names I knew, distant relatives, former neighbors, local historical figures, their innermost thoughts now lay bare on these supernatural pages. Then the text shifted again, and a chill ran through me as a new name formed at the center of the page. My name. But there was only one date listed beneath it. This isn't right, I said, backing away from the book. I'm not dead. Laughter rippled through the chamber, not cruel but gently amused. Death is not a moment but a transition, the voice explained. You walk the threshold now, neither fully alive nor fully departed. Your second date is yet to be written. The mist that had filled the cemetery began to seep into the mausoleum, sliding under the door and through invisible cracks in the walls. It gathered around my feet, thicker and more substantial than before. Within its swirling depths, I could now clearly see faces forming, some peaceful, others contorted in expressions of perpetual anguish. They wish to know you, the voice said, to share their stories. All ask in return is that you listen. The mist climbed higher, tendrils of vapor reaching toward me like grasping hands. One touched my ankle, and instantly a flood of foreign memories cascaded through my mind. A young man dying of fever in 1872, his last thoughts of the fiancée he would never marry. Another wisp brushed my hand, and I experienced the final moments of an elderly woman who had passed peacefully in her sleep in 1939, content with a life well lived. With each touch, more lives poured into me, hundreds of deaths, thousands of memories, centuries of human experience compressed into seconds of contact. Joy, suffering, triumph, despair, the full spectrum of emotion crashed through me in overwhelming waves. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of consciousness flooding my own. Stop, I gasped. It's too much. The mist receded slightly, though it continued to swirl around me, eager for further contact. They have been silent for so long, the voice said, now tinged with sadness. The living rarely listen. They visit, they leave flowers, they say words, but they do not truly listen. I struggled to my feet, my mind reeling from the onslaught of borrowed memories. What do they want from me? Some wish only to be remembered. Others seek forgiveness. Many hope to pass on wisdom earned too late to benefit them in life. And what do you want? I asked, finally addressing the presence directly. The air in front of me shimmered, condensing into a vaguely human shape, a figure composed of mist and memory rather than flesh and bone. It had no distinct features, yet somehow I recognized it, knew it on a level deeper than sight. I am the keeper, it said. I maintain the threshold between worlds. I record the names. I preserve the memories. Have I been here before? I asked, uncertain why the question came to me. The misty figure seemed to smile, though it had no face to express such an emotion. All have been here before, and all will return. Life is but a brief journey away from this place. The mist thickened around me again, more insistent now. The whispers grew urgent, hundreds of voices competing for my attention. Each had a story to tell, a memory to share, a warning to impart. I felt myself being pulled in too many directions at once, my sense of self beginning to fragment under the assault of other consciousnesses. My own memories, my childhood, my family, my name began to blur and fade, replaced by the borrowed experiences of the dead. Terror gripped me. "I need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't belong here." "Not yet." "Perhaps," the keeper agreed. "But having crossed the threshold, you will carry something back with you. The dead do not release their hold easily." I turned toward where I thought the door should be, but the dimensions of the chamber had shifted again. The entrance was nowhere to be seen. In its place, the rows of sarcophagi seemed to stretch into infinity. Panic rose in my throat. How do I get out? "The way out is through," the keeper said cryptically. Before I could demand a clearer answer, the floor beneath me began to change. The solid stone softened, becoming yielding and damp like freshly turned earth. My feet sank ankle deep into it, then knee deep. The sensation was horrifyingly familiar, like the inconsistent ground I had experienced outside, but far more pronounced. I was sinking into the floor as if it were quicksand. The mist swirled more frantically around me, voices rising to a fevered pitch. They were no longer welcoming but desperate, hungry. Hundreds of vaporous hands formed in the air, reaching for me, trying to grasp any part they could reach. "Stay," they pleaded. "Join us. Remember with us. Forget the pain of living." The earth had reached my waist now, cold and damp, pulling me down with inexorable force. The smell of soil filled my nostrils, not the clean scent of a garden but the musty, decaying odor of a grave. The keeper watched impassively as I struggled, offering neither help nor hindrance. "Please," I begged, reaching out a hand toward the misty figure. "I'm not ready." "Few ever feel ready," it replied. Yet all must eventually return to the earth. The ground had reached my chest now, compressing my ribs, making each breath a struggle. In moments, it would cover my shoulders, then my neck, and finally my head. I would be buried alive, or perhaps not alive for much longer. Desperation gave me clarity. Yet this place operated on symbolic logic rather than physical laws. Perhaps the way out wasn't a door but a state of mind. I closed my eyes, focusing all my will on a single thought: I reject this transition. My time has not come. I choose life. The pressure around my chest tightened painfully, as if the earth itself were trying to crush my resistance. The voices grew frantic, alternating between threats and promises. "Stay, and know the peace of eternal rest. Leave, and we will haunt your every waking moment. Stay, and learn the secrets of existence. Leave, and live in fear of your inevitable return." I held my resolve, repeating my mental mantra: I reject this transition. My time has not come. I choose life. Just as the earth reached my chin, something changed. A distant bell began to toll, 12 deep, resonant chimes that cut through the cacophony of whispers like a blade. Midnight. With the final toll, the pressure around me suddenly released. Instead of being pulled downward, I felt myself being pushed upward, ejected from the consuming earth like a seed sprouting in reverse. The mist scattered in all directions, the voices fading to startled exclamations and then to silence. I found myself sprawled on the floor of the mausoleum, a normal, small, stone chamber with a single sarcophagus at its center. No infinite rows of coffins, no glowing book, no impossible architecture. The keeper stood over me, now more clearly defined, a tall figure in outdated clothing, its features still indistinct but undeniably human in form. "You have chosen," it said, its voice fading like the last echo of the midnight bell. But remember, having walked the threshold, you will never again be entirely separate from it. Before I could respond, the figure dissolved into mist, which quickly dispersed, leaving me alone in the ordinary, dusty interior of the mausoleum. The door stood open, revealing the cemetery beyond, normal, quiet, unthreatening in the silver moonlight. I rose shakily to my feet and stepped outside, half expecting the ground to swallow me again or the mist to reform. But everything remained solid, fixed, real. My watch read 12:01. The hour had passed. I had won the bet. But as I made my way toward the gate, which was now clearly visible and reassuringly close, I became aware of something new, a constant, subtle whisper at the very edge of my hearing. Not threatening, not demanding, but present nonetheless. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that it would remain with me long after I left this place. The cemetery gate stood before me, its wrought iron bars gleaming in the moonlight like the teeth of some ancient beast. Freedom waited just beyond, the normal world with its streetlights and paved roads and blessed absence of whispering dead. I reached for the latch, my fingers trembling with relief and lingering fear. The cool metal felt reassuringly solid beneath my touch, a tangible connection to the physical world I fear I might have lost forever in the mausoleum. But as I pushed the gate open, a sharp pain lanced through my temple. I staggered, gripping the bars for support as a cascade of images flashed through my mind, a young woman throwing herself from a cliff after receiving news of her lover's death in war, a doctor succumbing to the very plague he had been fighting, a child lost in winter woods, lying down just to rest in the snow. Deaths. Dozens of them. Memories that weren't mine yet now resided within me, vivid as my own experiences. "We go with you," came the whisper, so faint I might have imagined it. I pushed through the gate despite the pain, desperate to escape. As I stepped beyond the cemetery's boundaries, the barrage of foreign memories subsided to a dull pressure at the back of my skull, present but no longer overwhelming. The street beyond looked unnervingly normal. Streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination on empty sidewalks. A car passed in the distance, its engine sound wonderfully mundane after the supernatural whispers of the graveyard. I checked my phone. The battery that had been nearly dead now showed 46% charge. Several missed calls and messages from my friends, time-stamped throughout the hour I'd spent in the cemetery. "Did you chicken out? Are you still alive in there? LOL, seriously, you okay? Let us know when you're out." I texted back a brief "I'm fine. Heading home." I couldn't begin to explain what had happened and wasn't sure I wanted to try. As I walked toward town, I felt a peculiar double awareness developing. On one level, the world appeared normal, houses with their warm, lit windows, the occasional late-night pedestrian walking a dog, traffic lights changing in their predictable sequence. But beneath that ordinary surface, I detected something new, a layer of history and memory imprinted on every location. As I passed an old Victorian house, I somehow knew that a woman had died of childbed fever in its master bedroom in 1883. The playground I cut through carried the lingering echo of a heart attack that had struck down an elderly man watching his grandchildren play in 1976. The dead had kept their promise. They were with me still. I quickened my pace, hoping that distance from the cemetery might weaken this unwanted sensitivity. But with each step, it seemed to grow more acute rather than less. The whispers remained at the edge of my hearing, a constant susurration like waves on a distant shore. Halfway home, I passed the town's small hospital. The sensation hit me like a physical blow, driving me to my knees on the sidewalk. Deaths, hundreds of them, layered throughout the building's history. The collective weight of so much passing pressed against my consciousness, threatening to overwhelm me as the mist had done in the mausoleum. I crawled away from the building, gasping for breath, only regaining my composure when I put a full block between myself and that concentration of endings. "Leave me alone," I whispered to the presence I now felt constantly surrounding me. I didn't agree to this. "You crossed the threshold," came the reply, not a single voice now, but a composite of many, speaking in unison. "The veil once parted is not easily mended." A chill ran down my spine. The keeper had warned me, but I hadn't understood the full implications. This wasn't just about a single night in a cemetery or winning a foolish bet. Something fundamental had changed within me, a door opened that perhaps could never be fully closed. By the time I reached my apartment building, exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead weights. All I wanted was the oblivion of sleep, a few hours respite from the whispers and borrowed memories. I fumbled with my keys at the entrance, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the door. The lobby was mercifully empty. No one to question why I looked like I'd seen a ghost, or rather, hundreds of them. As the elevator carried me to the 4th floor, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. Immediately, a new flood of images assaulted me, a maintenance worker who had fallen down the elevator shaft during the building's construction in the 1960s, an elderly resident who had suffered a stroke in this very car last year. My eyes snapped open. No escape, not even in darkness. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, surveying the familiar space that now felt strangely alien. Would my own home offer any sanctuary, or would I discover that death had visited here too? As if in answer, a particularly clear memory surfaced, not from the cemetery, but from this very room. The previous tenant, a middle-aged man, sitting in what was now my living room, swallowing a bottle of pills with methodical determination. His loneliness. His relief as consciousness faded. "No," I said aloud, pressing my hands against my temples. "I don't want to see this." "Yet you must," the voices replied. "To witness is your burden now. To remember is your purpose." I staggered to the bathroom, desperate to wash away the cemetery's lingering touch. Under the shower's hot spray, I scrubbed my skin until it reddened, as if the dead's influence were some physical contaminant that could be removed with enough soap and water. It made no difference. Even with water streaming over my ears, the whispers continued, steady and insistent. I didn't bother drying off completely, just wrapped myself in a towel and collapsed onto my bed. Sleep. I needed sleep. Perhaps in dreams, I could escape this newfound awareness. But as I drifted toward unconsciousness, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. The barrier between waking and sleeping seemed to amplify rather than diminish their presence. Dreams came, but they weren't my own. I experienced death after death, life after life, centuries of human experience compressed into hours of fitful sleep. I felt the last breaths of tuberculosis victims, the terror of those caught in burning buildings, the resignation of the elderly as their systems quietly shut down. I woke gasping just before dawn, sheets soaked with sweat, heart racing. The first gray light of morning filtered through my blinds. I had survived the night, but found no rest within it. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, one of the friends who had dared me to enter the cemetery. "Drinks tonight to celebrate your survival? Unless the ghosts got you, LOL." I stared at the message, a hysterical laugh building in my throat. If only he knew. As I contemplated a response, a new whisper, distinct from the general murmur that had become my constant companion, spoke directly into my ear. "Tell him. Show him the threshold. Share your burden." The suggestion sent ice through my veins. Spread this curse to others? Create more bridges between the worlds of the living and the dead? Never, I said firmly. But even as I spoke, a treacherous thought formed in my mind. Would sharing this burden dilute its weight? If others could perceive what I now perceived, would the dead divide their attention, lessen their hold on me? I shook my head violently, dispelling the thought. Whatever had happened to me in the cemetery, I wouldn't inflict it on anyone else, especially not a friend. I texted back, rain check. Not feeling well after last night. Rising from bed, I moved to the window and looked out at the awakening city. People hurried along sidewalks, heading to work or school, blissfully unaware of the past that saturated every street and building. Cars flowed along roads built atop forgotten graves. Children played in parks where centuries of human drama had unfolded. Life continued, heedless of all that had come before. And for the first time, I understood why the dead whispered so desperately to be heard. It wasn't malice that drove them, but the fear of complete erasure from memory. Now you begin to understand, the chorus approved. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. What happens now? I asked quietly. You live, they answered simply. You carry us with you. You remember what others forget. For how long? Until your own second date is written in the book of names. Until my death. I would bear this awareness, this connection to those who had passed, for the remainder of my life. As the realization settled over me, something unexpected happened. The whispers, which had been a chaotic jumble since I left the cemetery, began to organize themselves. The loudest, most desperate voices receded, replaced by a more measured, almost melodic murmur. They were adjusting, finding a balance that wouldn't shatter my sanity. I felt a profound gratitude for this small mercy, though I wasn't sure if it came from the dead themselves or from the mysterious keeper who had allowed me to leave the threshold. The morning sun broke fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across my apartment floor. In that moment of golden light, I made a decision. I would not run from this awareness. I would not fight it endlessly. I would learn to live with it, to understand it, perhaps even to use it. After all, I had chosen life. Now I had to determine what kind of life could be lived with one foot perpetually in the realm of the dead. I dressed slowly, deliberately, preparing to face a world that would never again appear purely as it seemed on the surface. As I reached for my jacket, my phone rang. Thomas again, probably confused by my rejection of the celebration he had planned. I hesitated, then answered. Hey, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. You okay? He asked. You seemed weird in your text. I searched for the right word. Different. After last night. A pause. What happened in there? Did someone mess with you? The whisper stirred, curious about my response. No, I said finally. Nothing like that. But I saw things differently afterward. It's hard to explain. Another pause, longer this time. You want to talk about it? I can come over. The whispers grew suddenly louder, more excited. I felt their collective attention sharpen, focusing on this moment of decision. Show him, they urged. Bring him to us. Let him see. I clutched the phone tighter, torn between my instinct to protect my friend and a new, insidious desire to share this burden, to no longer be the only one who could hear the dead. I don't think that's a good idea right now, I said finally. I need some time alone. If you're sure, Thomas said, concern evident in his voice. Just call if you need anything, okay? I will, I promised, and ended the call. As I slipped the phone into my pocket, I felt the whisper's disappointment, a collective sigh that seemed to stir the air around me. You deny us, they accused. I protect him, I corrected. And myself. But even as I spoke the words, I wondered how long my resolve would last. The loneliness of this experience stretched before me like an endless road. How long before I craved another who could understand? How long before the temptation to lead someone else across the threshold became too strong to resist? I pushed the thought away and opened my apartment door. Whatever path lay ahead, I would walk it one step at a time. But as I stepped into the hallway, heading toward an uncertain future, I couldn't shake the feeling that my journey had only just begun, and that the keeper of the threshold was watching, waiting to see what I would do with the gift, or curse, of my newfound sight. 1 week passed. Then 2. I developed routines to manage my new reality, meditation techniques to quiet the whispers when they grew too insistent, detours around places with particularly dense concentrations of death memories, careful rationing of sleep to avoid the most vivid dreams. I returned to work, where colleagues commented on my distracted air, the dark circles under my eyes. I blamed insomnia, not entirely a lie. How could I explain that closing my eyes meant experiencing hundreds of deaths, night after night? My friends grew concerned when I repeatedly declined invitations. Thomas especially persisted, stopping by my apartment unannounced when I ignored his texts. I spoke to him through the door, claiming illness, unwilling to risk proximity. The whispers grew frenzied whenever he was near, as if sensing my attachment to him, my vulnerability. He would understand, they insisted. Show him. Bring him to us. I resisted, though each refusal took more willpower than the last. The isolation was wearing me down. Human connection had become both desperately needed and terribly dangerous. On the 28th night after my cemetery visit, something changed. The whispers, which had maintained their measured, almost musical cadence for weeks, suddenly fell silent. The absence was so abrupt, so complete, that I woke from a rare peaceful sleep with a gasp. Hello? I called into the darkness of my bedroom, feeling absurdly abandoned. No response. Not a single murmur or sigh. For the first time in 4 weeks, I was truly alone in my head. Relief washed over me, followed almost immediately by suspicion. The dead had not released their hold out of mercy, something else was happening. I glanced at my bedside clock, 11:23 p.m. Almost exactly the same time I had entered the cemetery a month ago. And then I felt it, a pull, subtle but unmistakable, tugging at something deeper than my physical body. A compulsion to return to the place where everything had changed. The full moon. It was full again tonight, completing its cycle. No, I said aloud to the empty room. I'm not going back there. But even as I spoke, I found myself rising from bed, dressing mechanically, jeans, hoodie, running shoes good for quick movement. My body operated on autopilot while my mind screamed objections. I tried to resist, to force my limbs to stop obeying this foreign impulse. But the pull only grew stronger, more insistent, until my head pounded with the effort of fighting it. Return, a single voice finally broke the silence, not a whisper now, but a command that resonated through my entire being. I recognized it immediately, the keeper of the threshold. Why? I demanded, even as my hand reached for the doorknob, my feet carried me into the hallway. You said I was free to leave. Free to leave, but not to forget, the voice corrected. The cycle must complete. The threshold calls its walkers home. I found myself in the elevator, then the lobby, then the street outside, moving as if in a trance, unable to deviate from the path that led inexorably back to the cemetery. The night air was cool against my face, the streets eerily empty, as if the entire city were holding its breath. The moon hung bloated and pale in the cloudless sky, casting the same silvery light that had illuminated my first journey to the graveyard. I tried calling Thomas, some desperate part of me hoping human intervention might break this supernatural compulsion. The call went straight to voicemail. "If you get this," I said after the beep, my voice trembling, "I'm being drawn back to the cemetery. I can't stop myself. I don't know what's going to happen, but if I don't contact you by morning, please." I hesitated, realizing how insane anything I might say would sound. "Just look for me there," I finished lamely, and hung up. My pace quickened as I approached the cemetery, steps lengthening, urgency building in my chest. The iron gates came into view, standing open as if in welcome or expectation. At the entrance, I finally regained some control over my movements. The compulsion to enter remained powerful, but no longer completely overrode my will. I could pause here, at the threshold between ordinary reality and whatever waited beyond. "What do you want from me?" I called out, addressing the presence I now felt gathering all around. The keeper, the countless dead, the cemetery itself all seemed to have merged into a single aware entity. "Witness," came the reply, carried on a sudden breeze that stirred the yew trees. "Remember. Record." "I've been doing that," I protested. "I've carried your memories, heard your whispers. What more do you want?" "The book awaits your entry." A chill ran through me. The book of names, with its flowing text and single date beneath my name. Did this summons mean my second date was to be written tonight? Was I being called to my own death? Fear crystallized into determination. I had chosen life once before in the mausoleum. I would choose it again now. I took a deliberate step backward, away from the gate. "No. Find another witness." "I refuse." The breeze intensified, becoming a gust that whipped my clothes and hair. Leaves and twigs swirled around me in a miniature cyclone. The whispers returned, but distorted now, stretched and warped like voices on a damaged recording. The threshold must be maintained. Balance requires passage in both directions. One who sees must also be seen. I took another step back, fighting against the wind that now seemed determined to push me through the gates. I didn't ask for this connection. I never agreed to be your record keeper. Yet you crossed. The keeper's voice rose above the others. Freely. Willingly. Actions have consequences beyond intention. The cyclone tightened around me, debris stinging my face and hands. I raised my arms to shield myself, still backing away one stubborn step at a time. I was just accepting a stupid dare. I didn't know what it meant. "Ignorance does not negate impact," the voice responded, implacable. The threshold was crossed. The bond was formed. The cycle must complete. The wind became a physical force, lifting me momentarily off my feet. I stumbled, fell to one knee, still fighting against the inexorable pull of the cemetery. In that moment of vulnerability, something changed again. The whirlwind abruptly ceased. The whispers fell silent. The night became utterly still. Through the open gates, I saw mist beginning to rise from the ground, the same pearlescent vapor that had filled the cemetery on my first visit. It gathered thickness, coalescing into a vaguely human shape that drifted toward me with deliberate slowness. the keeper abandoning subtlety for direct confrontation. As it approached, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the mausoleum, a face forming within the mist, features assembling themselves from vapor and moonlight. Not threatening or monstrous, but tired. Ancient beyond reckoning and heavy with responsibility. It stopped at the boundary of the cemetery, seemingly unable or unwilling to cross onto the public street. "You resist," it said, its voice now coming from the misty approximation of a mouth. "You do." "I chose life," I reminded it, rising cautiously to my feet. "In the mausoleum." "You acknowledge my choice." "I did. But choice is rarely made once and forever. It must be renewed, tested, proven worthy. And if I refuse to enter? If I walk away right now?" The keeper's misty form rippled, a gesture that might have been a shrug. "Then the whispers will return, stronger than before. The memories will intensify until your mind can no longer separate them from your own. The pull will grow until no force of will can resist it. You're threatening me with madness if I don't comply. I am stating consequence, not threatening punishment. The threshold, once crossed, exacts its toll. I merely administer its laws. I weigh my options, such as they were. Continue resisting and risk deteriorating mental health, or enter voluntarily and face whatever completion of the cycle entailed. Neither choice appealed. "What exactly happens if I come with you?" I asked. "Will I die tonight?" The misty face formed what might have been a smile. "Death is not a moment but a transition," it repeated its earlier wisdom. "Your second date may be written tonight or years from now. That depends on many factors, including your choices in the hours to come." Not particularly reassuring, but it suggested I might survive this encounter if I played whatever game the threshold required. And the whispers? The memories? Will they stop afterward? "They will change," the keeper said carefully. "Their nature will be determined by how you complete the cycle." I took a deep breath, considering this cryptic response. So there are different ways to complete the cycle? Different possible outcomes? Yes. The threshold responds to intention and understanding as much as to action. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a suggestion that I might have some agency in this supernatural transaction. If the outcome wasn't predetermined, perhaps I could negotiate terms more favorable than the constant haunting I'd endured for the past month. "If I come with you voluntarily," I said slowly, "can I set conditions?" The misty figure seemed to consider this. "You may request. The threshold may grant if the balance is maintained." "What does that mean?" "What balance?" "Between witnessing and being witnessed. Between remembering and being remembered. Between the living world and what lies beyond." I thought carefully about what I might ask for, what terms might make this bearable. "If I complete whatever ritual or task you require tonight, I want the whispers to stop completely except at certain times of my choosing. I want control over when I access these memories, not constant invasion." The keeper's form wavered, stretching taller than contracting. "Possible, but only if you agree to regular witnessing, monthly, at the full moon. A monthly return to the cemetery. Not ideal, but vastly preferable to the constant haunting I'd experienced. And I want to understand what I'm part of," I added. "No more cryptic half-explanations. If I'm to be your witness or record keeper or whatever role you've assigned me, I deserve to know the full nature of the arrangement." "Knowledge has its own price," the keeper warned. "But this too can be granted, in measures you can bear." I nodded, feeling I was negotiating from a position of extreme weakness, but determined to secure whatever concessions I could. Then I'll come. Voluntarily. The misty figure extended a hand, or something approximating one, toward me. Then cross the threshold of your own will, and we shall complete what was begun. Heart pounding, I stepped forward, back onto cemetery grounds. The moment my foot crossed the boundary, the whispers returned, not the chaotic cacophony I'd grown accustomed to, but an ordered, almost ceremonial chant, like a procession of voices leading me deeper into the graveyard. The keeper drifted ahead of me, leading the way toward the center of the cemetery where the mausoleum stood. The mist thickened around us as we walked, obscuring distant headstones and creating the impression of a world contracted to just this path, just this moment. What am I? I asked as we walked. What did I become when I first crossed your threshold? You became a bridge, the keeper replied. One who can walk between worlds and maintain connection between them. Why me? There must be hundreds of people who visited this cemetery. Why was I chosen? You were not chosen. You chose, though unknowingly. Some souls naturally resonate with the threshold. Yours called to it, and it answered. We reached the mausoleum, its stone structure stark and ominous in the moonlight. The door stood open as it had on my first visit, the same pulsing light emanating from within. The keeper paused at the entrance. What comes next will not be easy, but it is necessary, both for the threshold and for you. The cycle left incomplete causes greater harm than its completion, however difficult. What exactly will happen in there? You will make your formal entry in the Book of Names. You will take up the role of bridge consciously, with full understanding of its responsibilities and privileges. And you will choose the nature of your service. My service? All bridges serve the threshold in their own way. Some collect the stories of the dead. Some ease the passing of the dying. Some guard against those who would exploit the connection between worlds. The form of service is determined by the bridge's nature and choices. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. And if I complete this ritual, I'll only have to hear the whispers when I choose to. I'll be free the rest of the time. As we agreed. The dead will speak to you only when you open yourself to them, with one exception. They may call you in times of great need, when the threshold itself is threatened. It wasn't perfect, but it was far better than what I'd been enduring. Then let's get this over with. I followed the keeper into the mausoleum, watching as the small stone chamber once again transformed into the vast hall I had witnessed before. The rows of sarcophagi stretched into the distance, the spinal columns soared overhead, and at the center, the dais with its glowing book waited. But this time, I noticed details I had missed in my previous terror, figures moving among the sarcophagi, some misty and indistinct, others almost solid in appearance. People. Or what had once been people. Some nodded to me as I passed. Others watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to gratitude. Other bridges? I asked, gesturing toward the more solid-looking figures. Yes. Those who came before you. Those who continue to serve even after their second date was written. The implication sent a shiver through me. You mean even after death? Death is not an ending but a transition, the keeper repeated for the third time. Some choose to continue their service from the other side of the threshold. We reached the dais. The Book of Names lay open, its pages glowing with that same pulsating light. Just as before, the text flowed and reformed constantly, names and stories briefly coalescing before dissolving back into potential. What do I do? I asked, staring at the uncanny document. Place your hand upon the page. Your story will reveal itself. Hesitantly, I reached out, fingers hovering above the luminous surface. This was the moment of commitment. Whatever happened next would irrevocably change my relationship with the threshold, with the dead, with my own life. Will it hurt? I asked, a ridiculous question that nonetheless seemed important in the moment. The keeper's misty features formed what might have been a compassionate expression. Transformation rarely comes without discomfort. But it will not destroy you unless you fight it. Not exactly reassuring, but I was beyond the point of turning back. I pressed my palm flat against the page. Light erupted from the contact point, flowing up my arm like liquid fire, neither painful nor pleasant but intensely present. The sensation spread throughout my body, illuminating me from within until I could see my own veins and arteries glowing beneath my skin. The page beneath my hand began to fill with text, not random names and stories now, but a single narrative. My narrative. Not just the events of my life as they had happened, but as they might happen, branching possibilities stretching into dozens of potential futures. I saw myself growing old, pursuing different careers, forming relationships, experiencing joys and sorrows, all the ordinary human experiences rendered extraordinary by being witnessed all at once. And interwoven with these mundane futures were other images, myself standing at bedsides as the elderly passed peacefully into death, walking through hospital corridors invisible to all but those nearest their end, sitting with the recently bereaved, somehow allowing them brief, healing connections with those they had lost. I was seeing the forms my service might take, the ways in which being a bridge could shape my future. I need to choose? I asked, overwhelmed by the multiplicity of paths. Your nature will guide you, the keeper said. Trust what draws you most strongly. I focused on the images, letting my attention flow naturally toward those that resonated most deeply. The paths where I provided comfort, where I helped ease both the dying and those left behind, these drew me with particular power. I want to help with transitions, I said, the words forming almost without conscious thought. Not just death to whatever comes after, but the transition of the living through their grief. I want to bridge the gap between loss and healing. As I spoke, the branching possibilities began to fade, leaving one path illuminated more brightly than the others, not fixed or predetermined, still containing variations and choices, but unified by the purpose I had declared. A compassionate bridge, the keeper observed. One who serves both sides of the threshold equally. A rare and valuable choice. The light flowing through me intensified, concentrating in my chest and head. Knowledge poured into me, techniques for opening and closing my awareness to the dead, methods for safely channeling their messages to the living who needed them, protections against entities that might abuse the connection I provided. With the knowledge came responsibility, a deep understanding that this power could harm as easily as heal if used carelessly or selfishly. I would need to develop discipline, boundaries, discernment. I accept this role, I said, the formal words rising unprompted to my lips. I will serve as bridge with compassion and integrity. The moment I spoke these words, my name appeared clearly on the page, followed by my birth date. The space for my death date remained empty, but now contained a small symbol I hadn't seen before, a figure of 8 laid on its side. The infinity symbol. What does that mean? I asked, pointing to the symbol. That your service continues beyond your physical death, if you choose it, the keeper explained. The opportunity, not the obligation. The light began to recede, drawing back from my extremities into my core, then concentrating in my right palm where it touched the book. When it finally faded completely, I lifted my hand to find a mark had formed on my skin, the same infinity symbol, faint as an old scar but clearly visible. Will others see this? I asked, tracing the mark with my finger. Only those who know to look for it. To most, it will appear as nothing more than a quirk of your skin's pattern. The book closed itself gently, the pulsing light dimming to a soft glow. Around us, the vast chamber began to contract, the impossible dimensions folding back into the physical reality of the small stone mausoleum. It's done, then? I asked, feeling strangely anticlimactic. The formal binding is complete. Your training has barely begun. The keeper's form was beginning to dissipate, becoming more transparent with each passing moment. Return at the next full moon. Your first lessons will commence then. And the whispers? They'll stop when I leave here tonight? They await your invitation now, not the other way around. To hear them, simply touch your mark and will it so. To silence them, do the same. Relief washed over me, so profound I felt lightheaded with it. Freedom from the constant intrusion, while retaining access to the connection when needed, exactly what I had hoped for. As the keeper faded to little more than an outline, I remembered one final question. What about Thomas, my friend? The dead seemed very interested in him. Were they trying to make him a bridge too? The last wisps of the keeper's form paused, then reformed briefly into a semblance of its face. Not all who cross the threshold become bridges. He would have become something else, something less balanced, more dangerous. You protected him well. With those ominous words, the keeper vanished completely, leaving me alone in the ordinary mausoleum. Outside, the cemetery had returned to its mundane appearance, peaceful, still, free of mist or whispering voices. The moon still hung full in the sky, but it no longer seemed malevolent or watching. I walked toward the gate, testing the silence in my mind. For the first time in a month, my thoughts were truly my own. The relief was almost dizzying. At the cemetery entrance, I paused to look back. In the silver moonlight, the gravestones and monuments stood as they always had, markers of lives concluded, memorials to those passed beyond ordinary perception. But now I understood they represented something more, acknowledgments of the threshold we all must eventually cross, and reminders that the boundary between worlds was thinner than most people ever realized. I touched the infinity mark on my palm, curious to test my new ability. Immediately, the whispers returned, but organized now, respectful of my authority as bridge, waiting for direction rather than clamoring for attention. Not tonight, I said softly. But soon. I promise. The whispers receded obediently, leaving blessed silence once more. I stepped through the gate onto the public street, no longer haunted but transformed, no longer merely a witness to the threshold but its conscious servant. Whatever challenges my new role might bring, I would face them with open eyes and full understanding. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Thomas, responding to my earlier message. What the hell? Are you okay? Do you need me to come find you? I smiled, typing back, I'm fine. Better than I've been in weeks. Get some sleep. I'll explain everything tomorrow. As I walked home through the quiet streets, I realized I was already planning what to tell him, how much to reveal. Not the full truth, that would be too much, too dangerous, but enough to explain my recent behavior, enough to repair our friendship. The mark on my palm tingled slightly, a reminder of my new reality. Bridge between worlds. Walker of the threshold. Keeper of the dead stories. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I found myself strangely at peace with the path that stretched before me, infinite in its possibilities, weighted with responsibility, but ultimately my own choice. An infinity of possibilities stretched before me. As I entered my apartment, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The morning light filtered through my windows, casting long shadows that no longer seemed ominous but simply part of the natural rhythm of existence. I slept dreamlessly for the first time since my cemetery visit, waking refreshed as afternoon sun warmed my face. When Thomas knocked on my door later that day, I no longer felt the need to hide. "You look different," he said, studying my face as I invited him in. "Better." "What happened?" I offered him coffee and a carefully edited version of my experience, a midnight walk that had given me perspective, a personal epiphany about grief and memory. Not lies, exactly, but shadows of the truth that he could safely comprehend. "So you're done being a hermit?" he asked, relief evident in his voice. "Yes," I smiled. "Though I might need some space sometimes. I'm starting some volunteer work with hospice patients." That part of my plan had come to me during the night. How better to fulfill my role as a compassionate bridge than by working with those approaching the threshold? In that liminal space between life and death, I could ease transitions from both sides. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected. But good, I guess." "It feels right," I said simply. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine. During days, I lived normally, reconnecting with friends, applying for hospice volunteer positions, gradually rebuilding the life I had nearly abandoned. At night, I practiced the skills that had been imparted to me during my ritual, learning to control my connection to the threshold, to filter the whispers, to distinguish between ordinary deaths and those requiring special attention. When the full moon returned, I walked voluntarily to the cemetery. This time, the keeper appeared at the gate not as mist, but as an elderly groundskeeper, visible only to me. "You've been practicing," he observed as we walked among the graves. "I have questions," I replied. "As all bridges do, at first." That night marked the beginning of my formal education, history lessons about previous bridges, practical techniques for channeling without exhaustion, ethical guidelines for intervention. I learned that I wasn't alone, that across the world, others like me maintained the delicate balance between realms. My hospice work proved to be the perfect complement to my supernatural role. The dying often sensed what I was, even without being told. "You've walked between, haven't you?" an elderly woman asked me during my third week, her eyes clear despite her failing body. "You'll help me across when it's time?" I held her hand, feeling the threshold already beginning to thin around her. "Yes," I promised. "When you're ready." 2 nights later, I was there when she passed. As her final breath left her body, I touched the mark on my palm, opening the connection. For a moment, she appeared beside her own body, confused but unafraid. "It's different than I expected," she said, looking around with wonder. "It usually is," I replied, guiding her toward the light that only she and I could see. Sometimes my role was more complex, helping restless spirits complete unfinished business, mediating disputes between the living and the dead when attachments grew unhealthy, occasionally even confronting entities that sought to exploit the threshold for their own purposes. Thomas noticed the changes in me, a new confidence, a deeper empathy, occasional disappearances during full moons. "You've met someone, haven't you?" he asked once, misinterpreting my secretive behavior. I laughed. "Not in the way you think." A year passed, then 2. My abilities strengthened with practice and guidance. I learned to recognize other bridges, a nurse at the hospital with the same infinity mark on her palm, a funeral director whose eyes held the same awareness mine did. We acknowledged each other discreetly, occasionally sharing information or assistance when our duties overlapped. On the anniversary of my 3rd year as a bridge, I sat in the cemetery under a full moon, conversing with the keeper about a particularly difficult transition I had recently facilitated. "You've grown into your role well," he observed. "Few adapt so completely." I traced the infinity mark, which had darkened over time. "I still wonder sometimes why me? What made me suitable for this?" "All bridges ask this eventually," the keeper said. "The answer is both simpler and more complex than most expect. You were chosen because you could bear it, because something in you already straddled the boundary between acceptance and denial of death. You feared it yet were fascinated by it. I considered this. And when my time comes, my second date, you will have choices others do not," he said simply. "But that day remains distant if you wish it to be." As dawn approached, I walked toward the cemetery gates, no longer afraid but respectful of the power they represented. Life and death, I had learned, were not opposites but complementary states, different aspects of the same continuous existence. The dead whispered their approval as I left, no longer desperate to be heard but patient in their eternal perspective. I carried their memories not as a burden but as a privilege, helping to ensure that what had come before was not forgotten, that what would come after was not feared. And in that balance, I had found not just purpose but peace, a life enriched rather than diminished by its proximity to death, a perspective that spanned beyond the limited horizon of a single human existence. I touched my mark once more, silencing the whispers as I prepared to rejoin the waking world. For now, I walked among the living, guiding where I could, witnessing always, bridging the gap between what was, what is, and what would someday be. The threshold would always be there, waiting. And when my time came to cross it permanently, I would do so not as a stranger, but as one returning to familiar ground, a bridge becoming part of the very connection it had served. Until then, I had work to do on both sides of the veil. Have you ever felt like the dead are trying to tell you something? The thought kept circling in my mind as I stared at the black and white photograph Thomas had placed on our coffee table. An old cemetery, shrouded in mist, with strange markings visible on several of the weathered tombstones. According to local legend, these symbols would glow under the full moon, but only on certain nights of the year. "I found it in my grandmother's attic," Thomas explained, his voice carrying a hint of excitement that I hadn't heard in months. "Along with these notes." He spread out yellowed papers covered in faded handwriting. One phrase stood out among the scribbles: "When the veil thins, they speak through the symbols." I glanced around at our small group gathered in my living room, Thomas with his perpetual camera hanging around his neck, Elena, our folklore expert, leaning forward with obvious interest, Marcus, skeptical as always but curious enough to show up, and Lily, who studied historical architecture and couldn't resist a mystery involving old structures. "I think I know this place," Elena said suddenly. "It's the old Raven Hollow Cemetery, north of town. It was abandoned in the 1930s after the flood." "That fits with my grandmother's notes," Thomas nodded. "She mentioned a tragedy that left the cemetery cut off from the town. A sudden gust of wind rattled my windows, making us all flinch. Outside, the October sky was darkening quickly, clouds gathering over the setting sun. "The full moon is tomorrow night," I pointed out. "We could go see for ourselves." I wasn't sure why I suggested it. Perhaps it was the monotony of our small-town lives, or maybe something in that photograph called to me. Either way, Everyone agreed with surprising enthusiasm. That night, sleep evaded me. My bedroom felt unusually cold despite the heater running. Just as I was finally drifting off, a sound caught my attention, like fingernails lightly scratching against glass. My eyes snapped open, heart immediately racing. The scratching continued, coming from my window. Just tree branches in the wind, I told myself. But when I finally gathered the courage to look, there were no trees near that side of the house. The scratching stopped the moment I drew back the curtain. Nothing was there except my own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. But as I turned away, I could have sworn I saw something move in the corner of the glass, a dark shape, there and gone in an instant. Morning came with blessed normalcy. I convinced myself it had been a dream, though the unease lingered as we made our preparations. We gathered flashlights, cameras, snacks, and extra batteries. Elena brought her notebook filled with regional folklore. Marcus, despite his skepticism, packed an EMF meter just for laughs. As we drove toward Raven Hollow that evening, the conversation was animated, theories bouncing between us. Only Lily remained unusually quiet, staring out the window. "You okay?" I asked. "I've been having strange dreams," she admitted. "About gravestones with symbols that move when you're not looking directly at them." A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't told anyone about the scratching at my window. The road to Raven Hollow Cemetery had long since been reclaimed by nature. We parked where the asphalt ended and continued on foot, following an overgrown path through increasingly dense woods. The October air grew sharper as the sun dipped below the horizon, our breath forming small clouds. "We should reach it just as the moon rises," Thomas said, checking his map. As we walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization fell away. No distant traffic, no airplanes overhead, just the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional call of birds settling for the night. Then, gradually, even those natural sounds seemed to fade, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. "Does it seem too quiet to anyone else?" Marcus asked, voicing my thoughts. Before anyone could answer, we emerged from the tree line, and there it was, Raven Hollow Cemetery, spread before us in the growing moonlight. A wrought iron fence, broken in places, encircled the grounds. Beyond it, dozens of headstones in various states of decay created a maze of shadows across the uneven ground. At the center stood a small stone chapel, its roof partially collapsed. The place was exactly as it appeared in the photograph, yet somehow more imposing in person. As we stood there, the clouds parted and moonlight spilled across the cemetery. That's when I noticed it, a faint blue glow emanating from several of the markers scattered throughout the grounds. "The symbols," Elena whispered. "They're actually glowing." I felt a shift in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The silence deepened, and with it came the distinct sensation of being watched by countless invisible eyes. We had found what we were looking for. Now I wasn't sure I wanted to know what would happen next. The cemetery gate creaked as Thomas pushed it open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I hesitated at the threshold, an inexplicable reluctance holding me back. Something about crossing that boundary felt irrevocable, as if we were stepping into a place where different rules applied. "Come on," Marcus urged, already following Thomas inside. "The symbols are definitely glowing. We need to document this." Swallowing my apprehension, I stepped through. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees the moment I entered the cemetery grounds. Elena and Lily followed, our small group now surrounded by weathered headstones and the soft blue glow of mysterious symbols. "Let's get closer to one," Thomas suggested, already moving toward the nearest glowing marker. As we approached, I could make out the strange pattern etched into the stone, not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something in between. The glow emanated from within the grooves, pulsing subtly like a slow heartbeat. Elena pulled out her notebook, sketching the symbol rapidly. This resembles some pre-Christian glyphs I've studied, but there's something different about them. Thomas snapped photos while Marcus waved his EMF meter over the stone. "Guys, this thing is going crazy," he said, his skepticism giving way to genuine surprise. Lily remained a few steps back, her arms wrapped around herself. "Can you hear that?" she asked suddenly. We all fell silent, listening. At first, I heard nothing beyond our own breathing. Then, gradually, I became aware of a sound so faint it seemed to exist between thoughts, like distant whispers, too indistinct to make out words. "It's just the wind," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There is no wind," I pointed out. The air around us was perfectly still. We moved deeper into the cemetery, drawn to the larger cluster of glowing tombstones near the ruined chapel. With each step, the whispers grew marginally clearer, though still incomprehensible. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite my heavy jacket. The symbols varied from stone to stone, but all shared that same unearthly blue luminescence. Some pulsed in unison, while others followed their own rhythm. Standing among them felt like being surrounded by strange, silent communication. "Let's split up and document different sections," Thomas suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." Something inside me screamed this was a terrible idea, but before I could object, everyone had already begun drifting toward different parts of the cemetery. I found myself alone near a tilted obelisk, its surface covered in the glowing patterns. I raised my flashlight, though the moonlight and the ethereal blue glow provided ample illumination. The beam caught something moving between distant gravestones, a flicker of white, there and gone in an instant. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting breaking the silence. My voice sounded wrong, somehow muffled yet too loud simultaneously. No response came except for the whispers, which now seemed to originate from directly behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but found only empty air. "Get a grip," I told myself. This is exactly what we came for. Evidence of something unexplainable. I forced myself to approach the obelisk, studying the symbols that crawled across its surface. As I watched, I could have sworn they shifted slightly, rearranging themselves under my gaze. I blinked hard, and they appeared normal again. The whispers intensified, and with them came a pressure in my ears, as if I had descended deep underwater. I tried to focus on documenting the symbols, taking photos with shaking hands, but found my attention continually drawn to the spaces between the tombstones, where shadows seemed to move independently of any light source. Time behaved strangely in that place. What felt like minutes of examination turned out to be nearly an hour when I checked my watch. I realized I hadn't heard from the others in too long. "Thomas? Elena?" I called out, my voice tight with growing anxiety. A figure emerged from behind the chapel, and I sagged with relief when I recognized Lily's outline. But as she drew closer, something about her movement seemed off, too fluid, almost gliding over the uneven ground. "Lily?" I took a step back instinctively. "Are you okay?" She stopped several feet away, her face oddly blank in the moonlight. "They've been waiting," she said, her voice carrying an unfamiliar cadence. "For someone to listen." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. "Who's been waiting, Lily?" Her eyes, reflecting the blue light of the symbols, seemed to look through me rather than at me. Those who were forgotten. Those whose stories were buried with them. I swallowed hard. Where are the others? Listening to stories, she replied, gesturing vaguely around the cemetery. Everyone has a story here. Even you. I've never been here before, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Lily smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes. But part of you has always been here. Part of everyone is. Before I could respond, a shout cut through the night, Marcus's voice, tight with panic. Without thinking, I ran toward the sound, leaving Lily standing motionless among the graves. I found Marcus backed against the cemetery fence, his EMF meter forgotten on the ground, staring at something I couldn't see. What's wrong? I asked, breathless from running. He pointed with a trembling hand. There was someone there, someone who couldn't possibly be there. I followed his gaze, but saw only headstones and shadows. What did you see? My grandfather, he whispered. But he's been dead for 20 years. The whispers around us surged, almost forming words now. The blue glow from the symbols intensified, casting everything in an otherworldly light. We need to find the others and leave, I said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at me. The cemetery suddenly seemed much larger than it had appeared from outside, the paths between graves twisting in unfamiliar ways. As we moved toward the chapel, searching for Thomas and Elena, I noticed something disturbing. The symbols on the headstones were definitely changing, shifting into new patterns before our eyes. What had started as a curious phenomenon now felt threatening, as if the very ground beneath us was awakening to our presence. And all around us, the whispers continued to grow, gradually resolving into a single phrase repeated over and over. Hear our stories. Remember our names. We found Thomas inside the ruined chapel, sitting cross-legged on the stone floor, his camera forgotten beside him. His eyes were fixed on the far wall where moonlight streamed through the broken roof, illuminating a large symbol carved into the stone, different from those on the gravestones, more complex and somehow more ancient. Thomas, I called, keeping my voice low. When he didn't respond, I approached cautiously and touched his shoulder. He startled, looking up at me with unfocused eyes that gradually cleared. Did you hear them? He asked. Hear what? Marcus asked, keeping close to the entrance. The stories, Thomas replied, rising slowly to his feet. They're everywhere. Everyone buried here, they're telling me how they died. How they were forgotten. A fresh wave of unease washed over me. Where's Elena? Thomas frowned, as if trying to remember something distant. She was taking rubbings of the symbols. Near the eastern wall. We need to find her and Lily, then get out of here, I said firmly. Lily? Thomas looked confused. I just saw her with you. Marcus and I exchanged alarmed glances. She wasn't with us, Marcus said. We thought she was with you. The chapel suddenly felt colder, the shadows in the corners deeper than they should be. The whispers that had been our constant companions since entering the cemetery grew louder inside these walls, echoing off the stone. Something's wrong with this place, I said, stating the obvious. The symbols, the whispers, it's affecting us somehow. Thomas nodded slowly. They're trying to make us understand. They need someone to hear their stories before they can. He trailed off, looking past us toward the chapel entrance. I turned to see what had caught his attention. At first, I saw nothing but the cemetery beyond, bathed in moonlight. Then, gradually, I became aware of faint translucent figures moving between the headstones, human shapes that weren't quite solid, that seemed to flicker in and out of visibility like candle flames in a breeze. "Oh God," Marcus whispered, all skepticism gone from his voice. The spectral figures didn't approach the chapel, instead drifting aimlessly among their own graves. Each one paused occasionally by a headstone with glowing symbols, placing insubstantial hands against the markers. "We need to find Elena and Lily. Now." My voice sounded strange even to my own ears, too calm for the circumstances. We left the chapel, stepping back into the cemetery that now seemed transformed. The pathways between graves had definitely changed, creating a labyrinth where before there had been clear lines of sight. The moon hung directly overhead, impossibly large and bright, bathing everything in silver light that mingled with the blue glow of the symbols. "Elena," Thomas called out, his voice swallowed by the unnatural acoustics of the place. We moved carefully among the graves, acutely aware of the spectral figures that seemed to take more solid form with each passing minute. None approached us directly, but I could feel their attention, their awareness of our presence. The whispers had become a constant background noise, occasionally resolving into clear words or phrases. "Remember us. Tell our story. The flood came so quickly. Never found my children." I found myself unconsciously avoiding stepping directly on any grave, as if disturbing the earth might provoke something worse than these melancholy apparitions. "There." Marcus pointed toward a cluster of particularly old graves, where a figure that was definitely solid sat with her back against a large tombstone. Elena didn't look up as we approached. Her notebook lay open on her lap, pages filled with frantically scribbled symbols identical to those glowing on the surrounding stones. Her hand moved automatically across the paper, adding more with each passing second. "Elena?" I knelt beside her, careful not to touch her after what had happened with Thomas. "Can you hear me?" She continued writing for several moments before slowly raising her head. Her eyes were dilated, reflecting the blue light of the symbols. "Their language," she said, her voice distant. "Not just symbols. Each one is a story, a life, a death." "We need to go," Marcus insisted, looking nervously at the ghostly figures that seemed to be gradually closing in around us. Elena shook her head. "We can't. Not until we understand. They've been waiting so long for someone to hear them." It was the same thing Lily had said, and the coincidence sent a fresh spike of fear through me. "Where's Lily? Have you seen her?" "She's with them now," Elena replied cryptically, gesturing toward the center of the cemetery. "Learning the oldest stories." Thomas helped Elena to her feet while I tried to make sense of our surroundings. The cemetery had definitely expanded somehow. What had appeared to be a relatively small graveyard from outside now stretched much further in all directions, the fence nowhere in sight. The spectral figures had multiplied, dozens now drifting between the stones, some beginning to take on more detailed features, clothes from different eras, faces with expressions of longing or sorrow. "Which way did we come in?" Marcus asked, turning in a circle, disorientation clear on his face. None of us could answer with certainty. The landscape had shifted too much, landmarks rearranged by whatever force governed this place. "We need to find Lily first," I insisted, though part of me wondered if we should just run in any direction until we hit the fence. Elena pointed toward the heart of the cemetery, where the largest concentration of glowing symbols pulsed in unsettling synchronization. "She'll be there." We moved forward as a group, staying close together as the path narrowed between increasingly elaborate mausoleums and monuments. The spectral figures parted before us, watching with hollow eyes as we passed. Some reached out with transparent hands that passed through our bodies like cold mist. With each step, the whispers grew more insistent, more coherent. The fever took us all in 1 week. They said I was a witch, but I only wanted to heal. The mind collapsed while they argued about safety. My husband's new wife made sure no one remembered me. Stories of tragedy, of injustice, of lives cut short and then forgotten by history. The emotions behind the words pressed against my consciousness: grief, anger, loneliness, and beneath it all, a desperate yearning to be acknowledged. We found Lily in a small clearing surrounded by the oldest graves, their headstones so withered that only the glowing symbols remained visible. She sat on the ground, surrounded by what I first took to be more spectral figures. But as we drew closer, I realized these apparitions were different, more solid, more present, with clearer features and clothing from a much earlier era. Lily was speaking, but not in any language I recognized. The words flowed from her in rhythmic patterns that matched the pulsing of the symbols around us. The apparitions listened intently, drawing closer with each phrase. "Lily?" Thomas called, his voice cracking. She turned toward us, and I had to stifle a gasp. Her eyes glowed with the same blue light as the symbols, and her skin had taken on a translucent quality, as if she herself was becoming one of the spectral residents. "You need to hear them," she said, her voice overlaid with others. "All of you. They've been silenced too long. We need to leave," Marcus insisted, grabbing her arm to pull her up. The moment he touched her, the atmosphere changed. The whispers cut off abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it hurt my ears. The ghostly figures surrounding us froze, then turned as one to stare at Marcus. "You shouldn't have done that," Lily said softly. The blue glow from the symbols flared to painful brightness. The spectral figures began to move toward us with purpose, their expressions shifting from melancholy to something darker. The temperature plummeted until our breath came in visible clouds. "Run," I whispered, a primal instinct taking over. "Run." We fled through the transformed cemetery, no longer concerned with finding the original path. Our only goal was distance, to put as much space as possible between ourselves and those advancing spectral figures. Thomas dragged Lily along, her movements sluggish and resistant as if she were sleepwalking. Elena followed, still clutching her notebook, while Marcus and I led the way. The gravestones seemed to shift around us, pathways closing off as soon as we passed through them. The moon cast harsh shadows that moved independently of their sources, reaching toward us with grasping fingers of darkness. All around, the ghostly residents of Raven Hollow watched our panic with hollow eyes, some following at a measured pace that somehow kept them always just behind us despite our desperate speed. "There!" Marcus pointed to a gap in the endless maze of monuments, a straight path leading toward what might have been the perimeter. We changed direction, lungs burning with the cold air, feet stumbling over uneven ground. "Wait," Lily's voice had changed again, returning somewhat to normal. She pulled against Thomas's grip. "We can't leave yet." "They're not angry, they're afraid." "Afraid of what?" I gasped, unwilling to slow our pace. "Of being forgotten again," she insisted. "Please, if we just listen." Her plea was cut short as the ground before us erupted upward. Soil and withered grass parted like water, revealing a gaping hole directly in our path. We skidded to a halt at its edge, nearly toppling forward into the darkness below. It wasn't a natural formation. The sides were too smooth, the depth too perfect. It resembled nothing so much as a freshly dug grave, one large enough for all of us. We backed away, turning to find another route, only to discover the spectral figures had encircled us completely. They maintained a distance of perhaps 20 feet, neither advancing nor retreating, simply watching with those empty, luminous eyes. What do they want? Thomas whispered, camera clutched to his chest like a shield. Elena stepped forward, her earlier trance seemingly broken by our flight. I think I understand now, she said slowly. The symbols, they're not just stories. They're names. True names, not the ones written on the headstones. What difference does that make? Marcus demanded. In many cultures, the true name is the essence of a person, she explained, her academic knowledge providing a lifeline of rationality. These people were buried, but their true stories, who they really were, got lost. The flood that isolated this cemetery destroyed records, disconnected families. No one remembered them as they truly were. The whispers returned, softer now, almost pleading. They just want to be remembered correctly, Lily added, the blue glow in her eyes dimming slightly. That's why they appeared during the full moon. They're looking for witnesses, for someone to hear them. I looked around at the ghostly gathering, seeing them with new eyes. Behind this spectral pallor, I could now make out individual features, a young woman with a pendant around her neck, an elderly man leaning on a cane, children holding hands, a figure in a miner's helmet. People, not monsters. People who have lived and died and been forgotten. If we listen to them, will they let us go? I asked, the first tendrils of understanding beginning to replace fear. I think so, Elena nodded. They've been trying to communicate since we arrived, but we were too frightened to understand. The ghostly figures seemed to sense our changing perspective. One stepped forward, a woman in clothes from the early 20th century, her form more substantial than the others. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the still cemetery air. The flood came in the night, she said, gesturing toward the eastern edge of the grounds. The river rose 20 feet in less than an hour. Those of us who lived in the valley had no warning. Hundreds drowned. Another figure stepped forward, an older man with a severe expression. They buried us here, but the flood cut off the cemetery from the town. The new road went around, and gradually, people stopped coming. Our descendants moved away. Our stories disappeared. One by one, they began to speak tales of lives cut short by accident, disease, or violence. Stories of families separated, of achievements unrecognized, of loves lost and found. Each account was brief but heartfelt, the essence of a life distilled to its most meaningful moments. And as they spoke, the symbols on the gravestones shifted, rearranging themselves into new patterns that somehow felt more settled, more complete. We stood in silence, bearing witness. My initial fear had given way to a profound sadness and a strange sense of privilege. These weren't malevolent spirits, they were simply people who wanted what everyone wants, to be remembered, to have their lives acknowledged as having mattered. The spectral woman who had spoken first approached Elena. "Will you record our true names?" she asked, gesturing to the notebook still clutched in Elena's hands. Elena nodded, opening to a fresh page. "I will, and we'll find a way to preserve them." For the next hour, though time still felt distorted in that place, we listened as the residents of Raven Hollow Cemetery shared their stories. Elena wrote frantically, filling page after page. Thomas, recovering his documentarian instincts, took photographs of the symbols as they changed, capturing the transformation. Lily moved among the spirits with surprising comfort, sometimes translating concepts that were difficult for them to express in modern terms. Even Marcus, whose scientific skepticism had been thoroughly shattered, asked questions that helped clarify details about life in the era most of them had lived. As for me, I simply listened, absorbing the emotional weight of each tale. Some were ordinary lives made extraordinary by small moments of courage or kindness. Others were lives of remarkable achievement cut tragically short. All of them deserve to be remembered. Gradually, the intense blue glow of the symbols began to fade. The spectral figures grew less substantial, some smiling or nodding in gratitude before fading entirely from view. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air warming to a normal October chill. When the last story had been told and the last spirit had faded, we stood alone in what now appeared to be a normal, albeit neglected, cemetery. The moon had begun its descent toward the horizon, suggesting that hours had passed since our arrival. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, glancing around at the now ordinary headstones. Elena closed her notebook, now filled with names and stories. "For tonight. But they'll be back with the next full moon. There are more stories here than we could hear in one night. Will anyone believe us?" Marcus wondered aloud, the question carrying a hint of his returning rationality. Lily, now fully herself again though somehow changed by the experience, gestured to Elena's notebook and Thomas's camera. "We have evidence. Not enough to prove ghosts exist, perhaps, but enough to ensure these people are remembered." I realized the hole that had opened in our path was gone, the ground undisturbed as if it had never existed. The paths between graves had returned to their original layout, and in the distance, I could make out the iron fence that marked the cemetery boundary. "Let's go," I suggested, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. "We can come back. We know the way now." As we walked toward the exit, I glanced back one last time. In the fading moonlight, I thought I saw a single figure standing beside the ruined chapel, the spectral woman who had first spoken to us. She raised her hand in what might have been a gesture of farewell, or perhaps gratitude. Then she too was gone, leaving only the quiet dignity of withered stone markers beneath the lightning sky. The drive back to town was mostly silent, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. Dawn was breaking as we reached the outskirts, the morning sunlight seeming almost foreign after our night in that otherworldly cemetery. The streets were empty, the town still sleeping, unaware of what we had experienced. We gathered at my apartment, too wired to consider sleep despite our exhaustion. Elena spread her notebook on the coffee table, the same spot where Thomas had first shown us the photograph that started our journey. The pages were filled with names, dates, and fragments of lives long ended but newly remembered. "What do we do with this?" she asked, the question encompassing more than just the physical notes. Thomas scrolled through the photos on his camera. Most showed the gravestones and glowing symbols clearly, though some had strange distortions, blurs of light or shadow where the spectral figures had stood. "I don't think anyone will believe us," Marcus said, the most changed among us. His scientific certainty had been fundamentally shaken. "Not really. They'll say the photos are manipulated, the stories invented. Does it matter if others believe?" Lily asked softly. She had been quiet since our return, her experience perhaps the most profound. The blue glow had left her eyes, but something had remained in her expression, a depth that hadn't been there before. "We know what happened. We remember them now." I moved to the window, watching the town coming to life with the morning. People beginning their daily routines, unaware of the thin boundary between their world and the one we had glimpsed. "We should do some research," I suggested finally. "Find out about the flood, about the people who lived in the valley. There might be records somewhere that corroborate what we were told." "The Historical Society might have information," Elena nodded. "And there's the newspaper archives at the library." "What about the symbols?" Thomas asked. They were changing as we listened. By the end, they looked settled somehow. Elena opened her notebook to pages of carefully drawn symbols. I think they're a language of memory. Each one represents not just a person, but who they truly were. As we heard their stories, the symbols became more accurate. The implications of that night hung in the air between us. We had crossed some threshold of understanding, witnessed something that defied conventional explanation. The world felt simultaneously larger and more intimate than it had before. We should rest, I said eventually. Meet later to plan our next steps. We agreed, but no one seemed eager to leave, as if our shared experience had created a bond that was difficult to break. Eventually, though, fatigue won out. Arrangements were made for everyone to check in later, and one by one they departed, leaving me alone in my apartment. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams. Not nightmares, exactly, but vivid reimaginings of the stories we'd heard, lives from another era playing out in fragmentary scenes. I woke in the late afternoon feeling as if I had lived several lifetimes in the span of a few hours. The group reconnected that evening at a quiet corner table in a local cafe. Everyone showed signs of the same restless sleep, but there was also an energy, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Elena had already visited the library. I found records of the flood, she reported, spreading photocopied newspaper clippings across the table. May 1928. Heavy spring rains caused the river to overflow its banks. The article mentions significant casualties, but doesn't list names. The cemetery was cut off when the old bridge was washed away, Thomas added, having done his own research. The town built a new road that bypassed it entirely. Within a generation, it was essentially abandoned. Marcus, surprisingly, had the most concrete information. I contacted a professor of folklore at the State University. Without mentioning our experience, I asked about symbolic languages associated with memory and preservation. She directed me to some fascinating research about how certain cultures use specific markings to capture the essence of a person after death. So it's not entirely unprecedented, I noted, finding some comfort in that. Not the concept, Marcus agreed. Though the manifestation we witnessed is, well, beyond anything documented in academic literature. Lily had been sketching in a small notebook throughout our conversation. She turned it around to show an intricate drawing of one of the symbols we had seen, not copied from Elena's notes, but drawn from memory. I keep seeing them when I close my eyes, she explained. But they're not frightening anymore. They feel important. They trusted us with their stories, I said. I think we have a responsibility now. The others nodded in agreement. Something had changed in all of us, a shift in perspective that couldn't be undone. We had been given a glimpse behind the veil that separates the living from the dead, and with it came an obligation. Over the weeks that followed, we dedicated ourselves to researching the history of Raven Hollow and its forgotten residents. We combed through archives, tracked down distant relatives, and pieced together a more complete picture of the community that had been largely erased by the flood and subsequent abandonment. Elena compiled the stories into a manuscript, combining what we had learned from historical records with the first-hand accounts shared by the spirits. Thomas created a photographic record, his images capturing the neglected beauty of the cemetery and subtle traces of its supernatural inhabitants. Marcus, embracing a new balance between skepticism and openness, provided historical context and validation where possible. Lily's contribution was perhaps the most striking, a series of paintings depicting the symbols we had seen, each paired with a portrait of the person it represented, based on historical photographs we had managed to locate or the impressions she had gathered during our night among the spirits. The full moon approached again, and with it came a growing tension. Would the phenomena repeat? Were we expected to return? The questions lingered, creating a constant undercurrent to our daily lives. The night before the full moon, I dreamed of the spectral woman who had first spoken to us. She stood in my bedroom, more suggestion than substance, her expression neither happy nor sad but expectant. "We will be waiting," she said simply, and I woke knowing what we needed to do. We returned to Raven Hollow Cemetery the following evening, better prepared this time. We brought lanterns, blankets against the autumn chill, recording equipment, and most importantly, the work we had done to preserve and honor the stories we had been told. The cemetery appeared normal at first, just an abandoned graveyard in the moonlight. But as we passed through the gates, that familiar shift in the atmosphere occurred. The temperature dropped subtly, sounds became muted, and gradually, the symbols on the headstones began to glow with that ethereal blue light. This time, there was no fear as the spectral figures emerged. They greeted us like old friends, gathering around as we showed them what we had created, the book of their stories, the photographs, the paintings that captured their essence. New spirits came forward, those whose stories we hadn't yet heard, eager to share their lives with people who would truly listen. We stayed until dawn, recording, witnessing, remembering. In the months that followed, our visits to Raven Hollow became a ritual tied to the full moon. Each time, we were greeted by familiar spectral faces alongside new ones emerging from the forgotten corners of the cemetery. Their stories became a tapestry of local history, more vivid and personal than any official record could capture. Winter brought challenges, snow-blocked paths, and bitter cold, but we persisted, huddled in a ruined chapel with portable heaters, listening as 19th century merchants and early 20th century schoolteachers shared their hopes, regrets, and small triumphs. By spring, word of our project had spread through academic circles. Elena presented our findings at a folklore conference, carefully framing our experience as oral history rather than supernatural encounters. Her paper was received with scholarly interest, particularly her analysis of the symbolic language we documented. Thomas held an exhibition of his photographs, atmospheric black and white images that hinted at presences just beyond normal perception. Critics praised his work for its haunting quality and emotional resonance, never suspecting the literal truth behind his art. The summer solstice marked a turning point. We arrived at Raven Hollow to find the cemetery transformed, overgrown paths had been cleared, fallen headstones righted, the chapel roof partially repaired. Posted at the entrance was a small sign, Historic Cemetery, Restoration in Progress. Our midnight documentation had not gone unnoticed. The Historical Society, intrigued by our research, had secured funding to preserve the site. Volunteers worked during daylight hours, leaving before dusk, unaware of the approval their efforts received from the permanent residents. That night, the spirits seemed more substantial than ever before, their voices clearer, their forms more defined. The woman who had first spoken to us, we now knew her as Elizabeth Carver, midwife and healer, approached with tears in her translucent eyes. "You've remembered us," she said simply. "After all this time, we exist again in the minds of the living." As midnight passed, something unprecedented occurred. The spectral figures gathered in the center of the cemetery, forming a circle around the oldest graves. The blue symbols pulsed in perfect synchronization, casting enough light to read by. Then, one by one, the spirits began to fade, not in the abrupt way they had disappeared at dawn during our first visit, but gradually, with expressions of peace. Elizabeth was the last to remain. "Some of us had been waiting nearly a century for this moment," she explained. "To be remembered was all we needed to find rest." By morning, the cemetery felt different, lighter somehow, though no less reverent. The symbols on many of the oldest headstones no longer glowed when the next full moon came. Those spirits, having shared their stories and been acknowledged, had moved on. Others remained, of course. There were still tales to be told, still names to be recorded. Our work continued, but with a deeper understanding of its purpose and meaning. 5 years have passed since that first October night when Thomas showed us the photograph. Raven Hollow Cemetery is now a protected historical site, with regular tours highlighting the unique lives of those interred there. Visitors often comment on the peaceful atmosphere, the sense of being welcomed rather than feared. Our small group has changed too. Elena's book, Forgotten Voices, The Lost Community of Raven Hollow, has become a respected work of regional history. Thomas teaches photography at the local college, specializing in capturing the unseen. Marcus founded a research institute dedicated to documenting oral histories and folklore. Lily's paintings hang in galleries across the country, her symbolic portraits instantly recognizable for their distinctive blue undertones. As for me, I've become the unofficial caretaker of Raven Hollow, living in a small cottage at the edge of the restored cemetery grounds. On full moon nights, I still witness the blue glow emanating from certain headstones, still hear whispered stories carried on the night breeze. Sometimes visitors ask if I believe the cemetery is haunted. I always give the same answer: Raven Hollow isn't haunted, it's inhabited. By memories, by stories, by the undeniable truth that a life, once lived, leaves an indelible mark upon the world. The dead were never trying to frighten us. They were simply asking us to listen. And in listening, we found that the veil between worlds isn't nearly as impenetrable as we once believed. It's thin enough for stories to slip through, thin enough for the living and the dead to reach a mutual understanding that being remembered is its own form of immortality. When the moon is full and the symbols glow, I still sit among the graves with my notebook open, ready to hear another story that deserves to be told. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.